Stop pretending and get up, my husband shouted, shoving his phone camera directly into my face while I lay completely paralyzed on the cold marble driveway. His mother stood behind him, leisurely sipping her champagne and complaining loudly that my pathetic cry for attention was single-handedly ruining her son's birthday celebration. They laughed together, genuinely and openly amused, utterly convinced I was staging some elaborate dramatic scene purely to steal the spotlight from Bradley. But as the warm blood pooled steadily beneath my head and my limbs refused to respond to my brain's desperate, frantic commands, my eyes locked onto his. He was not simply ignoring my pain, he was savoring it. My name is Madison. I am 34 years old, and until that precise, shattering moment, I truly believed I had built the perfect life. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a wealth management firm, completely self-made from absolutely nothing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever realized that the person you loved was actually your greatest enemy. I stared up at the darkening sky above our sprawling Connecticut estate. A massive, imposing mansion I had purchased entirely with my own hard-earned money just 6 months ago. The grand marble steps leading to the entryway were supposed to be a symbol of my ultimate achievement, a tangible monument to everything I had overcome. I grew up in a cramped, drafty trailer park where the rent was perpetually late and meals were assembled from whatever expired goods we could scavenge at the discount store. I worked 80-hour weeks for over a decade to drag myself out of that crushing, suffocating poverty, building my financial empire one demanding, exhausting client at a time. I bought this house to prove to myself, and to everyone who had ever doubted me, that I had finally made it. Instead, those very same luxury steps had just become my executioner's block. It was supposed to be a celebration. I had spent weeks meticulously planning a lavish 35th birthday party for my husband, Bradley. Bradley presented himself to the world as a visionary tech entrepreneur, constantly boasting about his cryptocurrency investments and ambitious startup ventures across his social media platforms. The reality was far less glamorous. He had not earned a single dime in 3 years. I funded his entire lifestyle without complaint, paying for his designer suits, his fleet of luxury cars, and his relentless, insatiable need to project an image of wild success to his thousands of internet followers. I was carrying a heavy silver tray loaded with expensive appetizers out to the patio when my heel caught on something unnaturally slick coating the top step. There was absolutely no time to catch myself. My feet flew out from beneath me and I went pitching violently backward into empty air. The impact was deafening and devastating. My neck violently struck the sharp marble edge of the step, sending a sickening crack reverberating through my skull like a gunshot. A blinding flash of white light consumed my vision entirely, followed instantly by a wave of physical agony so intense and all-consuming that it knocked every molecule of air from my lungs. I tumbled down the remaining 5 steps like a broken, discarded doll, landing in a twisted, unnatural heap on the cold, paved driveway below. I waited for the frantic rush of footsteps, the panicked, desperate shouts of my husband racing to my side. Instead, I heard the familiar electronic chime of a video recording beginning. Bradley stepped casually into my field of vision, his phone pointed directly at my bleeding, contorted face. "Get up, Madison," he sneered, his voice dripping with undisguised contempt and annoyance. "You are not going to ruin my birthday with your dramatic nonsense. Get off the ground right now." I tried desperately to speak, to beg him to call an ambulance, to tell him I could not feel my legs, but my jaw completely refused to open. Panic, cold and razor-sharp, began to spread rapidly through my chest like ice water flooding my veins. I sent a desperate internal command to my fingers to twitch, to my arms to lift, to my knees to bend. Absolutely nothing happened. My body was a heavy, lifeless anchor, completely and terrifyingly disconnected from my brain. I was trapped alive inside my own flesh. His mother, Beatrice, walked over with deliberate slowness, the ice clinking softly in her crystal glass. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. She had always despised me. A self-proclaimed suburban aristocrat, Beatrice never missed an opportunity to remind me that my accumulated wealth could never erase my humble origins. She happily spent my money while simultaneously mocking the very hands that earned every cent of it. "You can take the girl out of the trailer park," she scoffed dismissively, nudging my motionless shoulder with the pointed toe of her expensive designer shoe. "But you simply cannot teach her class." She glanced up at Bradley with theatrical exasperation. "Look at her, Bradley, lying in the dirt just to pull attention away from you. She is probably faking a concussion because she cannot stand the fact that today is about her husband and not her precious little company." I lay there staring up at them, my vision blurring and darkening at the edges. Blood was actively dripping down the side of my face, slowly staining the immaculate driveway I paid to have pressure washed every single week. I screamed internally, a primal, silent shriek, pleading for someone, anyone, to call for medical help. But the party raged on enthusiastically in the backyard, the heavy, pounding bass of the music easily drowning out the terrible, complete silence of my paralysis. Bradley adjusted his camera angle with practiced ease, making sure the patio lighting caught his face at its most flattering as he addressed his followers directly. "Can you believe this, guys?" he said into the phone, adopting his most convincing, exasperated husband persona. "My wife literally threw herself down the stairs because I was receiving too many birthday gifts today. Classic toxic behavior." He let out a genuine, amused chuckle that sent terrifying shivers down what remained of my functioning spine. In that horrifying moment of absolute physical vulnerability, the veil was finally, irrevocably lifted from my eyes. For 3 years of marriage, I had convinced myself that Bradley was simply misguided, that his financial failures were temporary setbacks, that his mother's cruelty was merely misplaced protectiveness. I had poured my hard-earned wealth into sustaining his happiness, wholeheartedly believing he truly loved me. But watching him film my broken, bleeding body for internet clout, I finally saw the undeniable, devastating truth. He did not merely lack empathy. He was entirely devoid of a soul. He was a parasite. And Beatrice was his devoted enabler. Both of them happily, greedily feeding off my massive success while openly despising the very woman who made it all possible. A warm, spreading sensation crept around the back of my skull as more blood escaped the deep gash carved into my head. My breathing grew dangerously shallow and labored. I realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that they were fully prepared to let me die right here on this driveway if it meant inheriting my company and my estate. They were waiting patiently for me to expire, completely unaware that my mind remained razor-sharp, recording every word, every laugh, every cruel gesture with crystalline precision. They thought I was finished. But they had vastly, fatally underestimated the survival instincts of a woman who had fought her way up from the absolute bottom with nothing but her own determination. If I survived this dark night, I was going to dismantle them both completely. The harsh glare of the patio lights illuminated the ever-growing pool of blood beneath my shattered head. Bradley was still holding his phone steady, carefully framing what he believed was my ultimate humiliation. He adjusted his stance to capture a better angle of my motionless body against the manicured, expensive landscaping. Beatrice took another slow, casual sip of her champagne, entirely unfazed by the gruesome scene unfolding at her feet. They believed they had all the time in the world to let me bleed out on the cold stone. They were utterly convinced they had executed a flawless plan to eliminate me and claim my wealth. They were profoundly wrong. The heavy wooden gate leading to the backyard swung open with a resonant thud. A party guest named Kevin walked around the corner of the house carrying a plate of catered food from the kitchen. He stopped dead in his tracks. The ceramic plate slipped from his hands and shattered violently against the pavement. He screamed my name, his voice cutting straight through the heavy bass of the party music like a blade. He sprinted toward me, completely ignoring the furious, withering glare my husband leveled in his direction. Bradley immediately lowered his phone, his face twisting with intense, undisguised irritation. "Relax, Kevin," he groaned, rolling his eyes dramatically. "She had too much to drink, and she wants to ruin my birthday dinner. Give her a minute and she will magically recover from her little tantrum." But Kevin ignored him completely. He took one look at the unnatural, alarming angle of my neck and the massive amount of dark blood soaking into the stone beneath me. He yanked his phone from his pocket with trembling hands and dialed emergency services without a moment's hesitation. Bradley stepped forward and reached out to grab Kevin firmly by the arm, demanding he hang up the phone immediately. Beatrice hissed at the guest, insisting he was grotesquely overreacting to a spoiled woman throwing a spectacular pity party. Kevin shoved Bradley aside with brutal, decisive force and shouted our address clearly to the emergency dispatcher. I lay trapped inside my unresponsive shell, my eyes tracking the darkening sky as the distant wail of approaching sirens finally pierced the suburban quiet. Flashing red and blue lights washed over the pristine facade of my mansion. An ambulance screeched to a halt at the edge of the driveway. Paramedic Ramirez leapt from the passenger side before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop. She seized her heavy trauma bag and sprinted toward my motionless body with practiced, urgent precision. She was a seasoned professional, her eyes instantly assessing the severity of the trauma zone with trained efficiency. But before she could even kneel beside me, Beatrice purposefully stepped directly into her path, crossing her arms to physically obstruct the medical equipment. "You are wasting your time, honey," Beatrice scoffed, looking down her nose at the paramedic with aristocratic contempt. "She is heavily intoxicated and throwing a massive fit for attention. Just drag her inside so my son can return to enjoying his celebration. Do not make a scene out of a simple drunken stumble." Paramedic Ramirez did not even blink. She used her shoulder to forcefully shove Beatrice aside without breaking stride, ignoring the older woman's outraged, indignant gasp. "Step back immediately or I will have you arrested for obstructing emergency medical personnel," Ramirez barked, her voice carrying absolute, unquestionable authority. Beatrice stumbled backward, her face flooding crimson with pure rage, while Bradley stood silently in the background, his jaw clenched tight. Ramirez dropped to her knees beside my head. She snapped on her blue latex gloves and carefully stabilized my neck to prevent any further damage. "Madison, can you hear me?" she asked clearly and deliberately. "Blink twice if you can hear my voice." I summoned every ounce of remaining willpower I possessed and blinked twice. "Okay, Madison, I am right here," Ramirez said, her professional tone offering the first small sliver of genuine comfort I had felt all night. "I am going to check your vitals and your mobility. Stay exactly as you are. Do not attempt to speak." She moved her hands methodically down my body, assessing my spine and extremities. I felt absolutely nothing, as though she were touching a phantom, a body that no longer belonged to me. Ramirez produced a small, sharp medical pin from her pocket. "I need to test your pain response and reflexes, Madison," she explained calmly. She removed my right shoe and dragged the sharp tip firmly across the sole of my bare foot. Zero response. My foot did not twitch, my toes did not curl. My leg remained completely, devastatingly dead against the cold pavement. Ramirez tried the left foot, pressing the pin harder and dragging it sharply across the sensitive arch. Still absolutely nothing, No reflex, no flinch, total and complete paralysis. The color drained instantly from Paramedic Ramirez's face. She looked up into my eyes, reading the sheer terror trapped behind my pupils. Her training engaged immediately. She recognized a catastrophic spinal cord injury. She stood abruptly to retrieve the rigid backboard from the ambulance, moving with intense, calculated urgency. As Ramirez stepped onto the top marble stair, her heavy-duty work boot suddenly lost traction. She slipped, catching her balance on the iron railing just in time. She frowned, studying the pristine stone surface with sudden suspicion. The stairs were completely dry. There was no rain, no spilled drinks, no mud or debris. Ramirez crouched down slowly, her eyes narrowing as she inspected the precise spot where my foot had slipped. She pressed her gloved fingers against the marble edge and rubbed them together carefully. I watched her expression shift from focused medical concern to absolute, chilling realization. She rose slowly, staring at the thick, invisible layer of slippery industrial-grade wax that had been deliberately and meticulously applied to the very edge of the top step. It was completely invisible to the naked eye, but lethally, fatally slick to any shoe. She looked at the wax. Then she looked at my broken, twisted body. Then she shifted her hard, penetrating gaze directly to Bradley, who was still holding his phone. Ramirez did not confront him. She did not ask a single question. She backed away from the steps slowly and deliberately, keeping her eyes locked on my husband. She reached for the heavy radio clipped to her shoulder harness. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I need immediate police backup at my location. Send multiple units. I have a critical trauma patient with complete spinal paralysis, and I have a highly suspicious scene. Possible foul play. Repeat. Expedite law enforcement to this address immediately." The words echoed across the quiet suburban driveway like a thunderclap. Possible foul play. The transformation in Bradley was instantaneous and deeply sickening to witness. The moment he heard those words, the mocking, annoyed husband persona vanished entirely. He dropped his phone onto the grass as if it had burned him. He fell to his knees on the hard pavement, clutching his hair, releasing a loud, theatrical wail of manufactured devastation. "Oh my God! My wife!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with practiced panic as he attempted to crawl toward me. "Please save her. Please tell me she is going to be okay. I cannot lose her. She just slipped. It was an accident. Please help my beautiful wife." He was sobbing hysterically, burying his face in his hands, playing the role of the traumatized, heartbroken spouse with revolting, Oscar-worthy perfection. Beatrice immediately joined the performance, dropping her champagne glass and clutching her chest as though she might faint from the weight of the tragedy. But I lay there in my own blood, trapped in my paralyzed shell, completely unable to expose their murderous charade. I watched the flashing lights of the approaching police cruisers illuminate Bradley and his counterfeit tears, knowing with utter certainty that he had carefully orchestrated my death, and was now directing his own twisted rescue scene with the same cold calculation he had applied to everything else. The chaotic symphony of the emergency room assaulted my senses the moment the ambulance doors swung open. Fluorescent lights strobed overhead in a blinding rhythmic blur as a team of trauma nurses rushed my stretcher through the sliding glass doors. I could hear the frantic squeak of rubber soles on polished linoleum and the urgent, clipped shouting of medical codes. I was a prisoner behind my own eyes. I could feel the rough texture of the cervical collar biting harshly into my jaw, but below my neck, a terrifying, absolute void remained. Bradley ran alongside my stretcher, hands dramatically clutching his head, sobbing loudly and begging the nursing staff to save his beautiful wife. His performance was genuinely worthy of an award. Just minutes earlier, he had been laughing at my broken body on the driveway. Now he was flawlessly embodying the picture of a devastated husband confronting the worst moment of his life. A tall doctor with silver hair and a stern, commanding expression took charge of the trauma bay. His badge read, Dr. Mitchell. He moved with practiced efficiency, shining a penlight into my pupils and firing precise orders at the nursing staff. "We need an immediate head scan and a full spinal MRI," he commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. "Get neurology down here right now. She has zero motor function in upper and lower extremities." Bradley hovered near the doorway of the trauma bay, pressing non-existent tears from his dry cheeks. Beatrice stood directly behind him, arms folded tightly across her expensive cashmere wrap, looking enormously inconvenienced, as though my near-fatal injury were a personal affront to her evening plans. The next 2 hours were a terrifying blur of cold machines and sterile, humming environments. They slid my paralyzed body into the loud, claustrophobic tunnel of the imaging machine. The rhythmic hammering of the magnetic coils echoed around my trapped form. I concentrated every fragment of remaining mental energy on attempting to move a single toe, a single finger, anything to confirm that I was still present and alive inside this useless, unresponsive shell. Nothing worked. The disconnect between my mind and my nervous system was absolute and impenetrable. When they finally wheeled me back into the private emergency suite, Dr. Mitchell was waiting with a grave expression on his face and a glowing tablet displaying the detailed scans of my spine. Bradley and Beatrice pushed their way into the small room, eager and impatient to hear the verdict. Dr. Mitchell addressed Bradley directly. "Your wife has suffered a massive traumatic injury to her cervical spine," he explained, pointing to the luminous screen. "The brutal impact caused severe swelling around the spinal cord. She is experiencing what we call spinal shock, a state of transient physiological reflex depression of cord function below the level of injury. In plain terms, her entire nervous system has shut down in response to the extreme trauma. She is completely paralyzed from the neck down. We cannot predict whether this condition is permanent until the initial swelling subsides. Recovery could take days, weeks, or it may be a permanent outcome." Bradley wiped his eyes on cue. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked, his voice carefully constructed to tremble. "Is she going to be paralyzed forever?" Before Dr. Mitchell could respond fully, Beatrice let out a loud, theatrical scoff that shattered the somber atmosphere of the room. She pushed past Bradley and marched directly up to the doctor. "Permanent or not, we are not keeping her in this ridiculously expensive facility," she announced, her voice shrill and authoritative. "Do you have any idea what a private room and round-the-clock care costs in a place like this? It is absolute robbery. She is just lying there doing nothing. We will take her back to the house immediately. She has a massive mansion with plenty of empty bedrooms. She can recover perfectly well in her own bed without us hemorrhaging money on your useless machines." I screamed silently inside my own mind. Taking me back to that isolated mansion while completely paralyzed was an unambiguous death sentence. Bradley and Beatrice would have total, unsupervised control over my care, my medication, and my life. They would find a way to finish what they started on the driveway. A pillow pressed over the face in the middle of the night. A deliberately missed dose of critical medication. A staged choking accident. No one would ever know the truth. Bradley nodded in ready agreement with his mother, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "My mother is right, doctor. My wife would hate being confined to a cold, sterile hospital room. She built a beautiful home and she would want to recover there, surrounded by familiar things. I can hire a nurse for daytime hours. We simply want to bring her home where she belongs and manage the costs responsibly." Dr. Mitchell regarded both of them as if they had completely lost their minds. He crossed his arms, his posture hardening instantly into something immovable. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice ringing with finality. "Your wife is in critical condition. She requires constant monitoring of her autonomic nervous system, continuous blood pressure management, and specialized respiratory observation. Moving a patient in the acute phase of spinal shock is not only medically negligent, it is a direct and immediate threat to her life. She is not leaving this hospital under any circumstances. Beatrice's face turned a violent, mottled shade of red. She pointed a manicured finger directly at the doctor. You cannot hold her hostage here just to inflate a medical bill. I know exactly how you people operate. You see a wealthy patient and you see dollar signs. But let me tell you something about this girl. She grew up in a filthy trailer park eating expired food from discount cans. She is far tougher than she looks. She does not need your fancy intensive care unit. I demand you process her discharge papers immediately. Her husband holds legal authority over her medical care. Dr. Mitchell did not retreat a single inch. He stepped closer to Beatrice, his full height bearing down on her with cold, unassailable professional authority. As attending physician, I have a legal and ethical obligation to act in the best interest of the patient, he countered sharply. Discharging a paralyzed trauma patient against medical advice requires a court order, which you will not obtain tonight. Furthermore, given the highly suspicious circumstances of her fall and the active police investigation initiated by the paramedics at the scene, this patient is going nowhere. She remains here under 24-hour hospital security. I lay frozen on the hospital bed, unable to smile, unable to speak, unable to cheer. But my heart sang. Beatrice's mouth dropped open in speechless shock. Bradley's face went completely pale, his fabricated tears evaporating in an instant. Their carefully constructed plan to drag my helpless body back to that isolated mansion and quietly eliminate me had been destroyed by strict hospital protocol. They were now trapped within the watchful gaze of doctors, nurses, and law enforcement, and I was finally safe enough to begin thinking about how to fight back. The clock, however, was ticking. And I had no idea yet how I would sound the alarm from inside my paralyzed cage. The heavy sliding glass door of the private intensive care room clicked shut, sealing me inside a sterile box of fluorescent light and rhythmic beeping. Dr. Mitchell and his team retreated to coordinate with the police department. The sudden absence of medical personnel left a suffocating, almost physical tension hanging in the antiseptic air. The only sounds remaining were the steady pulse of the heart monitor and the quiet hiss of supplemental oxygen feeding into my nose. The medical staff assumed the catastrophic trauma and heavy pain medication had rendered me unconscious. They were completely wrong. My body was an unresponsive tomb, but my mind was operating with terrifying, razor-sharp precision. Every auditory nerve was firing at maximum capacity, capturing the faintest rustle of fabric, the softest intake of breath. The moment the coast was clear, the facade evaporated. Bradley exhaled a sharp, frustrated breath and ran his hands roughly through his perfectly styled hair. He grabbed Beatrice by the elbow and dragged her into the darkest corner of the room. They moved out of my direct line of sight. But the acoustics of the enclosed suite carried every word of their hushed, vicious conversation straight to my ears. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Beatrice hissed, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. "You hit her far too hard. I told you to make it look like a simple, unfortunate trip. You nearly decapitated her. Did you see the way that paramedic examined the marble? She practically dusted the stone for fingerprints. You left a trail of suspicion a mile wide, and now we have police crawling around my property." Bradley scoffed, completely devoid of remorse. "Lower your voice," he snapped back. It had to look realistic. If she had merely bumped her head, she would have walked away with a headache and immediately gone to the authorities. I needed her entirely incapacitated. Her brain too scrambled to speak. The wax I applied to the marble edge is completely untraceable. By the time police obtain a warrant to inspect the property, the morning dew and the automated sprinkler system will have dissolved any chemical residue. The entire scene will read as a tragic accident caused by an exhausted woman in high heels. Beatrice paced the small corner, her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum. "Do not speak to me about being realistic," she retorted bitterly. "You lost control of the entire narrative the moment that paramedic called for backup. We are trapped here. If she wakes up and points a finger at you, you will spend the rest of your life in a federal prison, and I will lose everything." I listened to their exchange, my blood turning to ice inside my paralyzed veins. They were discussing my attempted murder as casually as one might review a poorly executed business transaction. The sheer, staggering magnitude of their cruelty was suffocating. I had purchased the designer wrap on Beatrice's shoulders. I had paid off Bradley's failed startup debts without a single complaint. And in return, they had conspired to crack my skull open on my own front porch. "Stop behaving like a paranoid old woman," Bradley growled, stepping toward her to assert dominance. "I have managed every detail. I wiped the primary security hard drive myself an hour before the party. The front door camera was completely deactivated. There is zero digital evidence connecting me to that staircase." He paused and allowed himself a dark, triumphant chuckle that turned my stomach. "And besides, it does not matter when she wakes up. The game is already won." "Are you absolutely certain the camera was off?" Beatrice asked, her tone shifting eagerly from anger to conspiratorial calculation. "Completely certain," Bradley confirmed with quiet, devastating pride. "And that is not even the best part. Do you remember that large stack of quarterly tax documents her accounting team sent over yesterday morning?" She was so exhausted from a 14-hour shift that she barely glanced at the pages before signing. I slipped a comprehensive durable power of attorney document directly into the middle of that stack. She signed her entire life away without reading a single heading. My heart monitor spiked violently, the machine emitting a rapid, high-pitched alarm. The sudden noise startled them, but neither Bradley nor Beatrice moved to check on me. They simply waited in the shadows until the beeping returned to a steady, normal rhythm. The full weight of his words struck me with the force of a freight train, a durable power of attorney. I had mindlessly signed a document granting Bradley absolute, unrestricted legal authority over my entire existence. Because I was currently incapacitated, that document was legally binding at this very moment. He now had the power to access my bank accounts, liquidate my investment portfolios, sell my real estate holdings, and legally authorize decisions about my medical care. He could instruct the doctors to withdraw my life support if he declared my recovery hopeless. "We do not need to bring her back to the mansion," Bradley whispered, his voice saturated with greedy anticipation. "The moment the banks open tomorrow morning, I am walking into the executive branch, presenting the signed power of attorney, and emptying her primary accounts directly into my offshore crypto wallet. By the time her corporate lawyers piece together what happened, the money will be completely untraceable. We will have enough to disappear from this city entirely and live like royalty while she rots in a state-funded nursing facility." Beatrice let out a slow, satisfied hum. "You had better make certain that document is bulletproof," she warned. "Her legal team is vicious." "It is ironclad," Bradley promised with absolute confidence. "I paid a very expensive, very discreet notary to authenticate it. She is finished, Mother. The trailer park queen has finally been dethroned." I lay imprisoned in my sterile bed, surrounded by monitors beeping in quiet mockery of my helplessness. My limbs were dead weight. My voice was silenced, and my husband was preparing to loot my entire life's work at the crack of dawn. Panic surged and threatened to consume me entirely, but a fierce, burning rage rose up faster and pushed it aside. I had not clawed my way out of poverty to be robbed blind by a mediocre, talentless parasite. I needed a weapon. I needed a lifeline. I needed to reach Harrison Cole, my ruthless corporate attorney. And I needed Kendrick, my brilliant brother-in-law who understood digital security better than anyone alive. But how could I possibly sound any alarm when I could not so much as twitch a single finger? The clock was ticking relentlessly toward morning. The battle for my life and my legacy had officially begun, and I had to find a way to strike back from inside my paralyzed cage before the sun came up. The heavy silence of the intensive care unit was shattered by the sound of rapid, authoritative footsteps echoing down the sterile hallway. The automatic doors slid open with a sharp mechanical hiss, and Harrison Cole marched into the room. Harrison was not merely a corporate attorney. He was a legal predator who had spent 40 years dismantling hostile takeovers and crushing predatory relatives in high-stakes estate battles across the country. Dressed in a flawless charcoal suit, silver hair immaculately combed, he radiated the quiet, absolute power of a man who had never once backed down from a fight. He did not ask for permission to enter. He simply occupied the space, his thick leather briefcase held at his side like a weapon. Bradley spun around, his manufactured grief instantly replaced by genuine alarm. Beatrice took an instinctive step backward, visibly intimidated by the sheer commanding presence of the man who managed my multi-million-dollar empire. "What are you doing here?" Bradley demanded, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it deeper. "This is a private medical facility. My wife just suffered a catastrophic accident and she needs absolute rest. Leave immediately." Harrison ignored him completely. He walked straight to my bedside, sharp blue eyes scanning my paralyzed body, the cervical collar, and the array of monitors tracking my vital signs. He rested his hands firmly on the plastic footboard at the foot of my bed. "Madison," Harrison said, his voice deep and unwavering. "I received an automated alert from hospital administration regarding your admission. I am here in my capacity as your chief legal counsel." Before he could continue, Bradley lunged forward, inserting himself physically between the attorney and my bed. He puffed out his chest in a desperate, futile bid to assert dominance over a man who had spent his career reducing corporate giants to rubble. "Did you not hear me?" Bradley shouted, his face blotching red. "You are not welcome in this room. My wife is in severe medical shock. She is completely paralyzed and unresponsive. As her legal husband and next of kin, I am taking full control of her care. I want you out of this hospital right now." Beatrice scurried to the wall and slammed her palm against the emergency call button. "Security!" she yelled toward the intercom. "There is an unauthorized intruder harassing a critical patient. Send guards to this room immediately." Harrison did not flinch. He turned his head slowly to regard Bradley with an expression of pure, freezing contempt. "You do not dictate terms to me, Bradley," he stated, his voice dropping to a controlled, dangerous register. "I represent the wealth management firm and the personal estate of the woman in that bed. My fiduciary duty is to her and her alone. I am fully aware of your considerable financial liabilities, your failing cryptocurrency ventures, and your sudden, urgent interest in her medical directives. If you believe for a single moment that you can isolate my client to facilitate a hostile financial takeover while she is incapacitated, you have catastrophically underestimated the legal consequences that are about to descend upon you." Bradley swallowed hard, a flash of genuine, unmasked panic crossing his eyes before arrogance reasserted itself. He pointed a shaking finger toward the hallway. "I am her husband," Bradley spat. "Under state law, I hold total medical and legal authority while she is in this condition. You have no jurisdiction here, Harrison. You are a hired suit. I am restricting all visitors starting this moment. Nobody enters this room without my written permission. Now get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." Two hospital security guards appeared in the doorway, glancing cautiously between the furious husband and the imposing attorney. Harrison knew the law better than anyone in that building. He knew that resisting security would produce only a useless arrest, leaving me entirely defenseless. He picked up his briefcase slowly, his face an impenetrable mask of cold calculation. But before he turned to comply, Harrison took one deliberate step around Bradley. He leaned close over the side rail of my hospital bed, bringing his face inches from mine. Bradley shouted at the guards, but Harrison ignored the erupting chaos at his back. He looked deep into my eyes, searching the terrified, frozen depths of my pupils for any sign of consciousness trapped inside my paralyzed shell. I summoned every remaining fragment of willpower. I focused entirely on my eyelids. I stared directly into the sharp blue eyes of the only man who could protect everything I had built, and I blinked. Once. Twice. Deliberate and unmistakable. A clear, unambiguous signal. A silent scream for help. Harrison's breath caught for just a fraction of a second. The corner of his mouth twitched upward into the briefest, most imperceptible smile. He had caught the signal. He knew I was fully conscious. He knew I was locked inside my body, listening to every word, completely aware of the murderous plot my husband was orchestrating around me. The guards placed their hands firmly on Harrison's shoulders, pulling him toward the sliding glass door. He did not resist, but as he reached the threshold, he locked eyes with Bradley one final devastating time. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Enjoy playing the grieving husband while you still can, Bradley," Harrison declared, his voice resonating with cold authority down the sterile hospital corridor. Loud enough for every nurse and doctor within earshot to hear every syllable. "Because I am heading straight to a federal judge the moment the courthouse opens its doors. If a single penny moves from her corporate accounts, if a single medical decision is made that in any way compromises her safety, or if I discover that this so-called accident was anything other than a simple, unfortunate fall, I will personally ensure that you spend the remainder of your miserable existence locked inside a federal prison cell. You are officially on notice." Harrison turned on his heel and strode down the hallway, his powerful, deliberate footsteps fading gradually into the distant hum of the hospital. The security guards lingered near the doorway, watching Bradley carefully before finally retreating to their posts. Bradley stood frozen in the center of the room, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow, panicked breaths. Beatrice rushed to his side and grabbed his arm with trembling hands. The sheer, unshakable confidence behind Harrison's threat had clearly rattled them both to their rotten cores. They had successfully isolated me physically, using their legal marital status to construct a fortress around my hospital bed. But as I lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, a massive surge of fierce hope flooded my paralyzed veins. They believed they had severed my only lifeline. They had absolutely no idea that Harrison Cole was now fully armed with the truth, and that my ruthless attorney was already preparing to launch a legal war that would burn their greedy ambitions straight to the ground. The rhythmic, steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping me tethered to reality after Harrison was escorted from the intensive care unit. Bradley and Beatrice had stepped out into the hallway to speak aggressively with the hospital administration, desperate to solidify their legal stranglehold over my medical directives. My eyes were fixed on the ceiling tiles when the heavy door slid open again. My sister-in-law, Caroline, strode into the room reeking of cheap perfume and unearned entitlement. Right behind her was her husband, Kendrick, a brilliant, sharply analytical information technology auditor who worked for a top-tier cybersecurity firm. He was precise, methodical, and completely, conspicuously out of place in this family of greedy, predatory parasites. Unlike Bradley, Kendrick actually earned his money, and he operated with a strict, unwavering moral compass. He took one look at my immobilized body connected to the breathing apparatus, and I saw a flash of genuine, undisguised horror cross his features. Caroline, however, did not even bother to offer a sympathetic glance in the direction of my hospital bed. She made a direct, purposeful line for the small plastic belongings bag the nurses had placed on the corner chair. "What are you doing?" Kendrick asked, his deep voice thick with barely concealed disgust. His posture stiffened visibly as he watched his wife aggressively tear open the clear plastic bag containing the clothes and personal items I had been wearing during the fall. She shoved her manicured hands deep into the blood-stained fabric of my dress without a moment's hesitation, completely unmoved by the gruesome sight. "Bradley sent me a text message right before we got off the elevator," Caroline muttered, her eyes darting nervously around the room like a common thief casing a target. "He said he needs the master key to her home office safe. The banks are requesting secondary verification for the corporate accounts, and all of her physical authentication tokens are locked inside that steel box." She upended the contents of my designer handbag onto the vinyl guest chair, carelessly tossing aside my expensive cosmetics and personal identification documents as if they were worthless trash. Kendrick clenched his jaw so tightly I could see the muscle jumping sharply in his cheek. "You are actively searching a paralyzed woman's belongings for a safe key while she lies completely helpless right in front of you," he stated flatly, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Have you people entirely lost your minds? She could have severe brain damage." Caroline scoffed without looking up, ripping open the hidden zipper compartment of my wallet. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Kendrick. She is basically brain dead anyway. My brother is simply trying to secure the family assets before the market opens tomorrow morning. He needs that key right now." I lay frozen on the mattress, internally boiling with an indescribable volcanic rage. Caroline was cheerfully acting as an accomplice in her brother's financial heist, treating my horrific accident like a lucrative and exciting treasure hunt. She aggressively patted down the pockets of my ruined jacket, muttering curses under her breath when she came up empty-handed. Kendrick watched her frantic, mercenary search with cold, analytical eyes. He was a man who identified critical discrepancies for a living, and the massive, glaring discrepancies in every aspect of this situation were practically screaming at him. Suddenly, Caroline's cell phone buzzed loudly in her coat pocket. She snatched it out, her face lighting up with greedy anticipation as she read the caller identification. "It is my mother," she announced quickly, already grabbing her purse. "She probably has an update from the hospital billing department. I need to take this in the hallway where the reception is better. Do not touch anything, Kendrick. I will be right back to finish checking her coat." Caroline practically sprinted out of the intensive care unit, the heavy glass door sliding shut behind her and sealing Kendrick and me inside the quiet, sterile room. The moment we were completely alone, Kendrick's entire demeanor underwent an instant, dramatic transformation. The rigid, mildly annoyed brother-in-law vanished entirely, replaced by the highly trained cybersecurity expert operating at full capacity. He moved swiftly and silently toward my hospital bed, pausing to check the hallway through the narrow slats of the glass blinds to confirm that Caroline was fully distracted. He leaned down over the metal side rail, bringing his face close to mine. "Madison," Kendrick whispered, his deep voice barely audible above the steady hum of the oxygen machine. "I know you are in there. I read the medical charts at the nurses' station. Spinal shock does not mean brain death. I know your mind is fully awake." I stared directly into his dark, intense eyes. I gathered every ounce of remaining energy concentrated in my paralyzed body and gave him one slow, unmistakable, deliberate blink. Kendrick exhaled a sharp, quiet breath of relief. A fierce, determined fire ignited immediately behind his gaze. "Listen to me very carefully, Madison," he urged, already moving with efficient, practiced speed. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a tiny, sophisticated piece of hardware, a miniature eye-tracking sensor, completely discreet and extraordinarily advanced. Attached to it by a thin wire was a small, modified burner smartphone. "Bradley is moving fast," Kendrick explained in a rapid, controlled whisper. "He has already submitted the forged power of attorney to your primary investment bank. He is attempting to drain the corporate liquidity funds before the morning bell. Kendrick slid the burner phone deep beneath my mattress pad, tucking it where the nurses would never discover it during routine checks. He then took the tiny eye tracker and expertly clipped it to the flexible plastic arm of my supplemental oxygen tube, positioning the microscopic camera precisely in front of my right pupil. It blended seamlessly with the existing medical equipment surrounding me. I bypassed the biometric lock on the device, Kendrick continued, his fingers moving across the screen with the practiced speed of a man who had done this 100 times before concealing it. The eye tracker is calibrated to your pupil movements. You can type, send encrypted messages, and access the internet simply by looking at a custom keyboard projected onto the hidden screen. It is connected to a secure, completely untraceable cellular network. Harrison Cole already has the encryption key. You now have a direct, unmonitored line to your attorney. I blinked twice, a silent, overwhelming expression of pure gratitude. My brother-in-law was putting his entire career and his marriage at risk to save my life. I am not finished yet, Kendrick whispered fiercely, his eyes narrowing with cold, steely resolve. I know Bradley is a pathological liar, and I know he disabled the primary security cameras before your fall. But he is a technological amateur who vastly overestimates his own capabilities. He has absolutely no knowledge of the secondary local area network you asked me to install on your private servers last year. Tonight, I am going to hack directly into your home security mainframe. I am going to bypass his primitive data wipes and excavate the deleted cache. If he did anything deliberate to cause this accident, I will uncover the digital footprint. And I will hand the evidence personally to the federal authorities. The handle on the sliding glass door began to turn. Kendrick snapped instantly backward, crossed his arms, and adopted his previous posture of mild annoyance with flawless precision, just as Caroline pushed her way back into the room. My mother says the hospital administration is giving them serious pushback on the discharge papers, Caroline complained, marching directly back to my scattered belongings. She shoved her hands back into my blood-stained coat without any hesitation. We need to find that safe key so Bradley can pay off the medical director. I lay completely motionless on the sterile hospital bed, but inside my mind, a ferocious, unstoppable battle cry echoed with deafening force. The tiny sensor hovered invisibly beside my eye. A powerful digital weapon placed into my hands by the one person in this nightmare I could truly trust. Bradley believed he had completely isolated me. He was convinced he had severed my voice and stolen my empire. He had absolutely no idea that I was now fully armed, directly connected to my ruthless attorney, and backed by a cybersecurity expert who was preparing to tear his murderous lies apart line by line of code. The real war had only just begun. The morning sun had barely crested the city skyline when the private elevator doors parted on the top floor of my wealth management firm. Lying in my hospital bed, I stared with burning, focused intensity at the hidden screen projected by the eye tracker Kendrick had so brilliantly installed. The encrypted feed bypassed the hospital network entirely, streaming high-definition security footage from my corporate headquarters directly to my retina. I watched with barely contained fury as Bradley strode into the immaculate glass reception area of the empire I had constructed from absolutely nothing. He was wearing one of the bespoke Italian suits I had purchased as part of his birthday celebration, completely abandoning his usual casual, performative tech entrepreneur aesthetic. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and moved with the unearned, nauseating arrogance of a conquering king claiming a throne he had stolen at knife point. My chief operating officer and my entire executive board were already filing anxiously into the main conference room. Bradley had apparently issued an emergency mandate using my personal email account, which he had undoubtedly accessed and compromised overnight. The boardroom was my sacred professional sanctuary. featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district, and a massive mahogany table where I had negotiated billion-dollar portfolios and built lasting relationships with the most powerful investors in the country. Bradley dropped into my chair at the head of the table, slamming his briefcase onto the polished wood with a loud, deliberately aggressive thud. The executive team exchanged nervous, apprehensive glances around the table. Gregory Pierce, my chief financial officer, sat to the immediate right of Bradley. Gregory was a 30-year veteran of the financial industry, a man who operated on strict adherence to data compliance and absolute institutional transparency. He adjusted his glasses and studied Bradley with measured, barely concealed apprehension. "Thank you all for gathering on such short notice," Bradley began, adopting a practiced, mournful tone that made every cell in my body revolt with disgust. "I come to you this morning with genuinely devastating news regarding my wife. Last night, Madison suffered a catastrophic accident at our home. She fell down a flight of marble stairs and sustained severe, irreversible trauma to her brain and spinal cord." A collective, audible gasp moved through the boardroom. Several of my most senior executives covered their mouths in genuine, stricken shock. Gregory leaned forward, his face draining of color. Bradley pressed a fabricated tear carefully from the corner of his dry eye. "The leading neurologists at the hospital have informed my mother and me that Madison is in a permanent vegetative state. She has zero cognitive function remaining and zero possibility of meaningful recovery. The brilliant, driven woman who built this extraordinary firm is, for all intents and purposes, gone." I blinked rapidly and furiously at the screen, incandescent with rage at his monstrous, calculated performance. I was entirely and acutely conscious, watching him attempt to dismantle everything I had sacrificed my youth to build. "But Madison was a true visionary," Bradley continued, pivoting swiftly and seamlessly from his manufactured grief to his actual agenda. "She prepared meticulously for every conceivable worst-case scenario. She understood that her family and her company would need comprehensive protection if the unthinkable ever occurred." Bradley reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick, imposing stack of legal documents. He placed them deliberately in the center of the mahogany table. "This is a comprehensive, durable power of attorney," Bradley announced, his voice shifting from performative grief to naked, aggressive authority. "Madison executed this document before a licensed notary public. It grants me total, unrestricted legal and financial control over her personal estate and over this entire wealth management firm. Effective immediately, I am assuming the role of acting chief executive officer." The boardroom fell into a heavy, stunned silence. I could see the disbelief washing visibly across the faces of my team. I had never permitted Bradley anywhere near my corporate assets, and every executive in that room knew, with absolute certainty, that I considered his cryptocurrency ventures to be dangerously volatile and recklessly managed. Gregory Pierce reached forward and carefully drew the document toward him. He methodically flipped through the pages, scrutinizing the legal language and closely examining my forged signature on the final page. "We need to stabilize the company portfolio immediately to prevent a panic among our top-tier investors," Bradley commanded, leaning aggressively over the table. "To guarantee continued market confidence, I am initiating an immediate capital injection into a secure secondary holding firm that I personally manage. Gregory, I need you to authorize an emergency wire transfer of $5 million from the primary corporate liquidity account to the offshore routing number provided in that folder." Gregory went completely still. He looked up slowly from the fraudulent document, his eyes narrowing with quiet, professional intensity as they locked onto my husband. $5 million? Gregory repeated, his voice stripped of all warmth. You are asking me to liquidate $5 million of operating capital and wire it to an unverified offshore cryptocurrency wallet less than 12 hours after our founder has allegedly suffered brain death. It is not a request, Gregory, Bradley snapped, his carefully maintained mask of the grieving husband slipping entirely to expose the greedy, desperate parasite underneath. It is a direct executive order from the legal head of this company. My crypto fund is uniquely positioned to hedge against the inevitable market volatility caused by Madison's tragic accident. Process the wire transfer. Immediately. I watched the feed, my heart hammering against my immobilized ribcage. Bradley was clearly panicking. His mounting illegal debts to the criminal underworld were coming due, and he was cynically leveraging my tragedy as a vehicle to rob my company at gunpoint. Gregory calmly closed the folder and pushed it deliberately back across the table. I cannot and will not authorize that transfer, Gregory stated, his voice carrying the resonant, immovable weight of 30 years of professional integrity. Company protocol requires that any executive leadership transition or significant liquidation of assets be formally verified by our chief legal counsel, Harrison Cole. Furthermore, a power of attorney enacting total corporate control requires independent medical verification of incapacitation from a hospital board, not the unilateral word of a spouse. Bradley's face turned a violent, mottled crimson. He slammed both fists onto the mahogany table with enough force to rattle the heavy glass water pitchers. Harrison Cole is a glorified paper pusher, Bradley roared, spit flying from his lips. I hold ultimate authority in this firm. You work for me now, Gregory. I work for Madison, and I protect her investors. Gregory fired back with calm, absolute precision, refusing to concede a single inch. Until Harrison Cole walks through that door and independently validates that document, not a single cent leaves this building. Bradley's chest heaved with unchecked, spiraling rage. He snatched the fraudulent document and shoved it directly toward Gregory's face. You have exactly 24 hours to complete whatever verification you require, Bradley snarled, his voice cracking off the glass walls. If that $5 million is not sitting in my holding account by this time tomorrow morning, I will personally fire you and every executive at this table. I will liquidate your pensions, destroy your professional reputations, and end your careers permanently. Do not test me. He seized his briefcase and stormed out of the boardroom, leaving my executive team in stunned, shaken silence. I closed my eyes in the hospital bed, a fierce, triumphant energy pulsing through my paralyzed body. Bradley believed he could bully and intimidate his way to $5 million. But he had just declared open warfare on a team I had personally spent years training to be absolutely, lethally ruthless in defense of the firm. The clock was ticking, and he had no idea whatsoever that Harrison Cole was already in motion, preparing to drop the ultimate legal guillotine directly onto his disintegrating scheme. The sterile hospital ceiling became my digital battlefield. Through the tiny lens of the eye tracker Kendrick had so precisely positioned on my oxygen tube, a translucent digital keyboard projected directly onto my retina. Every deliberate blink demanded a monumental expenditure of focused will. My physical body remained a lifeless, unresponsive shell on the intensive care mattress, but my mind was operating with terrifying, relentless velocity. I had to neutralize Bradley before he could bully Gregory and the executive board into releasing my life's work into his fraudulent cryptocurrency accounts. I focused my right pupil on the letter H. I blinked with precision. Then the letter A. Another controlled blink. The sophisticated software registered my microscopic eye movements with flawless accuracy, translating my desperate, determined gaze into a heavily encrypted outgoing message. Composing a single sentence required agonizing, exhausting minutes. My eyes burned from the sustained concentration, and the harsh fluorescent lighting of the trauma ward pressed relentlessly at the edges of my vision. But I refused absolutely to close my eyes. I navigated through the secure firewall Kendrick had bypassed, accessed the direct, untraceable communication line to Harrison Cole, and began transmitting. Harrison and I had spent years constructing fail-safe defenses against precisely this kind of hostile corporate assault. Together, we had designed an absolute nuclear option for the firm, a catastrophic emergency protocol known only to the two of us and our most senior security architects. It was called Protocol Lazarus. If activated, it would instantaneously sever all external access to every corporate bank account, lock down the entire investment portfolio with maximum level encryption, and revoke all executive signing privileges across every platform and institution simultaneously. Activation required a unique dual authentication code that I had committed to memory on the very day we incorporated the firm. I stared at the projected command interface. I focused my vision with every fragment of remaining concentration and blinked out the sequence. Protocol Lazarus authorized. Execute immediate financial freeze. I added a second encrypted transmission warning Harrison about the forged power of attorney and Bradley's attempt to strong-arm Gregory into wiring $5 million. I engaged the digital send function with one final, forceful blink. A green confirmation banner flooded my vision. The encrypted package had successfully reached Harrison's private secured server. I lay back against the stiff hospital pillow, my heart slamming against my ribs. The digital missile had been launched. Now I simply had to wait for the explosion. Across the city, inside the towering glass headquarters of the primary investment bank managing my corporate liquidity, Bradley was pacing the polished floors like a cornered, desperate predator. The eye tracker feed had shifted to the secondary security cameras, granting me a real-time, unobstructed view of his attempted heist. He was inside the soundproof, luxuriously appointed private office of the senior bank manager, a composed man named Preston. Bradley was practically vibrating with barely contained, greedy anticipation. He had completely discarded the grieving husband routine the moment he crossed the building's threshold. He slapped the fraudulent power of attorney onto Preston's heavy mahogany desk and issued his demands with the arrogant certainty of a man who had never once been told no. "I do not care about your standard 24-hour holding period," Bradley snapped, leaning aggressively over the desk in a transparent attempt to physically intimidate the banker. "My wife is lying in a hospital bed with catastrophic, irreversible brain damage. The board of directors has already been formally notified of my executive succession. I need that $5 million routed to the specified holding account immediately, right this second, to prevent a complete market panic. Process the wire transfer, Preston, or I will personally pull every single corporate account from this institution by tomorrow afternoon." Preston adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable with Bradley's aggressive, erratic behavior. He carefully examined the forged document, scrutinizing the notary stamp and my fraudulent signature with practiced professional attention. Everything appeared superficially, dangerously sound. Preston turned to his dual-monitor setup and entered the corporate account numbers, initiating the massive wire transfer sequence. Bradley stood immediately behind him, his eyes locked with naked greed onto the computer screen. He could practically taste the stolen millions already. He was mentally calculating, in real time, how quickly he could pay off the dangerous criminal associates he owed, and still retain enough to fund the extravagant, consequence-free lifestyle he believed he was owed. Preston's fingers hovered over the final execution key. He pressed enter. For one agonizing, suspended split second, the loading icon spun perfectly normally. Bradley exhaled a sharp, shuddering breath of apparent relief. A smug, triumphant smile stretched slowly across his face. Then the entire banking system froze. The loading icon vanished. In its place, a massive, blinding red warning banner locked both monitors simultaneously. The digital alarm pulsed with a stark, unambiguous message in bold capital letters: account frozen, active legal dispute, protocol Lazarus initiated, all executive privileges revoked by order of Chief Legal Counsel. Preston gasped and physically recoiled from his screens. He frantically clicked his mouse and hammered at his keyboard, but the system was completely, immovably, dead. A secondary alert message populated across both monitors, instructing the bank to reject all pending transactions immediately and contact Harrison Cole's office without delay. "What did you do?" Bradley roared, the smug smile obliterated entirely from his face. His voice cracked and broke apart with raw, undisguised panic. "Process the wire transfer. I gave you a legally binding power of attorney. I am the acting chief executive officer of that firm. You are stealing from me." Preston raised both hands defensively, his face completely drained of color. "I did not do anything, sir," he said, his voice unsteady, pointing at the pulsing red screens. "The account has been struck with a maximum security legal freeze. The system will not permit me to bypass it under any circumstances. The firm's chief legal counsel has just executed an emergency lockdown protocol. The funds are completely inaccessible. The account will remain frozen until the legal dispute is formally resolved in federal court." The full, devastating realization struck Bradley with the force of a demolition charge. He stared at the red warning banner, his chest heaving with rapid, terrified breaths. Harrison Cole had moved with a speed and precision he had never anticipated. The lawyer had neutralized the forged document in a matter of minutes, sealed off every financial artery, and left him standing in a bank manager's office with absolutely nothing. Bradley understood in that moment that he was no longer fighting a paralyzed, voiceless woman lying helpless in a hospital bed. Someone highly capable, strategically ruthless, and several moves ahead was actively orchestrating his complete destruction from behind the scenes. Bradley snapped completely. The thin, brittle veneer of his fraudulent businessman persona shattered all at once, exposing the violent, cornered parasite underneath. He seized the heavy brass lamp from Preston's desk and hurled it with full force against the wall, exploding it into fragments. He swept both arms across the desk in a single savage motion, sending the computer monitors, the keyboard, and stacks of financial documents crashing to the floor in a cascade of noise and debris. Preston shouted urgently for bank security, scrambling backward out of his chair to put maximum distance between himself and the sudden, frightening outburst. Bradley ignored the terrified banker entirely. He snatched the useless forged power of attorney from the devastated desk and crumpled it violently in his shaking hands. He kicked a heavy leather guest chair across the room and released a torrent of vicious, incoherent profanity that reverberated through the private banking suite and undoubtedly penetrated every wall on the floor. His perfect, immaculate plan had been reduced to smoldering rubble. The $5 million he urgently, desperately needed to protect his life from the criminal underworld was locked inside an impenetrable, inaccessible digital vault. And the key was in the hands of his worst enemy. I watched his complete psychological collapse through the encrypted feed on my eye tracker. Lying perfectly, serenely still in my hospital bed, an overwhelming wave of fierce, bone-deep, triumphant satisfaction washed over my paralyzed body. Bradley was officially, irreversibly trapped. He had no money, no legal standing, no power, and a catastrophic, life-threatening debt bearing down on him with no exit in sight. The counterattack had been executed with flawless precision. And my husband was finally, viscerally beginning to understand that he had chosen to wage war against exactly the wrong woman. The blinding red warning banner on the bank monitor had demolished Bradley's illusion of absolute, unchallenged control. He had stormed out of the financial district with an empty briefcase and a staggering new reality pressing down on him from every direction. He was locked out of my corporate empire. Harrison Cole had slammed the steel vault shut on the $5 million he needed to survive. But Bradley was a cornered animal. And cornered animals with crushing, dangerous debts to the criminal underworld do not simply surrender and accept defeat. They find another way to feed. If he could not steal my corporate liquidity through forged legal documents, he was going to leverage the only remaining asset still nominally under his control: his social media following. Lying in my intensive care bed, I watched the digital projection from Kendrick's hidden eye tracker illuminate my retina with a new, urgent priority notification originating from Kendrick's secure server. My brother-in-law had flagged a sudden, massive spike in digital traffic emanating from Bradley's public profiles across multiple platforms. I focused my right pupil and blinked to open the encrypted link. What I saw made the blood in my paralyzed veins run to absolute glacial ice. Bradley had uploaded a heavily and expertly manipulated video to every single one of his social media accounts simultaneously. He had taken the horrifying footage he had gleefully recorded of me bleeding on the marble driveway and transformed it into a grotesque masterpiece of calculated digital manipulation. He had meticulously excised every moment of himself laughing at my broken body and instructing me to stop performing. He had surgically removed Beatrice's contemptuous remarks about my trailer park origins. In their place, he had layered a delicate, melancholy acoustic piano track over the silent footage of my shattered, motionless form. And then recorded himself delivering a voiceover, sobbing with practiced, heartbreaking precision, begging the universe and whoever was listening to please spare his beloved wife. The caption beneath the video was a clinical masterclass in psychological warfare and targeted character assassination. It read, "My beautiful wife Madison pushed herself too hard. She sacrificed her health, her family, and her peace of mind to build her wealth management firm. She worked 18-hour days until her body simply gave out. Her exhaustion caused her to collapse on our front steps. Please let this be a warning to everyone who sees this. No amount of money is worth losing the person you love. Pray for her survival." He was publicly and deliberately attributing my catastrophic, surgically induced spinal injury to my own professional ambition. He was weaponizing my dedication, my discipline, my decades of relentless sacrifice, turning every quality I was proud of into evidence of a fatal character flaw that had ultimately consumed me. He was framing me as a tragic, self-destructive workaholic who had collapsed under the weight of her own obsession. But the character assassination was merely the strategic setup for his actual, financial objective. Attached prominently to the viral video was a direct link to a crowdfunding campaign. The campaign headline boldly demanded $1 million for Madison's emergency experimental spinal treatments. Bradley had composed a lengthy, meticulously crafted description, claiming with absolute fabricated conviction that my insurance provider had refused to cover the cutting-edge neurological surgeries required to save my life, and that, without the immediate generosity of strangers, his beloved wife would have no hope of recovery. He pleaded with his followers and the broader public to donate whatever they could possibly spare to help him afford the crushing medical costs of keeping me alive. Every single word of it was a complete, calculated, shameless fabrication. My premium health insurance covered every single aspect of my intensive care without exception, and Bradley had absolutely zero intention of paying a single hospital bill. That $1 million was destined to travel directly into the offshore cryptocurrency wallets of the violent loan sharks to whom he owed his life. I blinked rapidly, scrolling down the page with growing, suffocating dread. The video had hit the algorithm with devastating precision. It was already accumulating hundreds of thousands of views and climbing aggressively. The progress bar on the fraudulent fundraising campaign was actively, visibly surging upward in real time. $5,000, $20,000, $50,000. The numbers ticked relentlessly higher as sympathetic, completely deceived strangers emptied their wallets into his fraudulent account without a moment's hesitation. The most agonizing part of watching this spectacle was not the financial theft itself. It was the absolute, unhinged vitriol flooding the comment section beneath the video. Bradley's meticulously crafted narrative had successfully turned the entire internet against me with surgical efficiency. I watched, helpless, immobilized, entirely voiceless, as thousands of complete strangers dissected my character, demolished my reputation, and enthusiastically validated his elaborate, monstrous lies. I focused my eyes on the top comments. A user with thousands of approving likes had written, "This is exactly what happens when women try to act like corporate machines and forget how to be wives. She brought this on herself by prioritizing greed over her marriage." Another read, "Her poor husband looks completely devastated. He clearly loved her so much, and she just neglected him for her business. I hope he finds peace." A third comment added, "She chased the almighty dollar until she literally fell over. Now all that money cannot even buy her a functioning spine." They called me a cold, heartless villain who deserved to be humbled. They praised Bradley as a devoted, selfless partner standing faithfully by a wife who had never genuinely appreciated him. He was absorbing their adulation and their money simultaneously, while I was being digitally crucified in real time. The sheer, suffocating injustice of it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, constricting the oxygen flowing through my nasal cannula. He was monetizing my attempted murder. He had pushed me down those stairs to steal my company and my life. And when Harrison blocked that avenue completely, he had immediately and without hesitation pivoted to using my paralyzed, broken body as a prop to defraud the grieving public. He was converting my trauma into a lucrative crowdfunding enterprise to save his own skin from the criminal syndicate bearing down on him. A fresh, sickening wave of donations flooded across the screen. $100,000 crossed the threshold. Bradley was winning the public relations war decisively. He was rapidly securing the liquid cash he desperately needed to stay alive. But as I read the hateful comments calling me a failure and a cautionary tale, I did not break. I did not surrender to the dark, crushing despair attempting to drag me under. The rage that ignited inside me was purer and hotter and more clarifying than anything I had ever experienced in my life. Bradley thought he was a genius for exploiting the internet's capacity for outrage and misplaced sympathy. He had catastrophically failed to realize that by creating this enormous, highly visible public spectacle, he was personally handing me the precise weapon I needed to destroy him completely. Every single dollar that entered that fraudulent crowdfunding account constituted a separate federal count of wire fraud. By soliciting funds under demonstrably false pretenses across state lines through a digital platform, he was elevating his crimes directly into the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was publicly, voluntarily, meticulously documenting his own felonies for the entire world to witness and preserve. I blinked deliberately at the eye tracker interface, capturing high-resolution screenshots of the manipulated video, the climbing donation counter, and every fraudulent medical claim he had published. I compiled the complete digital evidence into a secure, encrypted file. He wanted to use the internet to brand me as a tragic, overworked cautionary tale. I was going to use his own viral scam to guarantee he spent the next 20 years inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. I closed the browser window and transmitted the compiled evidence packet directly to Kendrick's encrypted server. The trap was being carefully, methodically constructed. And my husband was walking. The digital projection of the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign faded from my retina as the heavy intensive care unit door slid open. The subtle shift in air pressure immediately signaled an intruder. I fixed my eyes on the ceiling tiles and maintained the blank, vacant stare of a woman permanently locked in a vegetative state. The sharp, unmistakable clack of expensive designer heels on the linoleum floor identified my visitor before she had even stepped into my line of sight. Beatrice. She had not bothered to bring Bradley with her this time. She had no need to perform the devoted, weeping mother-in-law act for the medical staff or the police officers stationed in the hallway. She marched directly to the large glass window facing the busy hospital corridor and yanked the privacy blinds aggressively and completely shut. The bright fluorescent light from the hallway vanished instantly, plunging my sterile room into harsh, claustrophobic shadows. She walked slowly and deliberately to my bedside, her expensive silk scarf trailing behind her like a royal cape, a cape that I had purchased with the corporate profits from my own wealth management firm. Beatrice leaned over the metal bed rail, bringing her face uncomfortably, invasively close to mine. The sickeningly sweet scent of her imported floral perfume temporarily overwhelmed the sharp antiseptic smell of the medical environment. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the plastic edge of my mattress, knuckles whitening with suppressed malicious excitement. She looked down at my immobilized body with an expression of pure, unrestrained, gloating triumph. "You really thought you were so incredibly smart, did you not?" Beatrice whispered, her voice a toxic, venomous hiss that carried perfectly through the darkened, quiet room. "You thought your ruthless little corporate lawyer could swoop into this hospital and completely destroy my son. Well, Harrison Cole may have frozen your precious company accounts, but he cannot touch the digital goldmine Bradley just created on the internet." She let out a low, dark chuckle that sent an involuntary chill racing along the recovering nerves of my spine. "My son is a brilliant, resourceful survivor, Madison. Your fancy attorney locked the front door of the bank. So Bradley simply opened a massive window on social media. Hundreds of thousands of dollars are pouring directly into his private, untraceable accounts at this very moment. The entire world is convinced you are a tragic, overworked corporate failure. And they are happily, generously compensating my son for his tremendous suffering." She paused, letting the words settle into me like poison. "You handed him the ultimate financial payday by falling down those stairs. He does not even need your corporate liquidity anymore. The sympathetic public is literally funding our escape plan while you lie here utterly useless." Beatrice reached out and jabbed my limp, paralyzed shoulder with a sharp, contemptuous finger. I felt absolutely nothing from the physical contact, but the sheer, naked disrespect burned through my mind like acid through silk. She had always viewed my existence as a stain on her family's prestige, conveniently ignoring the inconvenient truth that her family had been entirely bankrupt before I married her son. "You are nothing but a broken piece of meat occupying an extraordinarily expensive hospital bed," Beatrice continued, her eyes gleaming with cold, genuine hatred. "Bradley is legally processing the medical paperwork with the hospital administration as we speak. You think you are remaining in this private suite under police protection indefinitely? Think again. The moment the doctors formally declare your spinal condition permanent next week, I am personally taking charge of your long-term medical placement. As your legally designated caregivers, we have every right to determine where you spend the remainder of your vegetative existence." She leaned even closer, her breath washing warm and nauseating across my cheek. "I am going to place you in the most miserable, criminally understaffed, state-funded nursing home I can legally locate in this entire country. I will find a facility so thoroughly neglected that the staff will not even bother to reposition you to prevent the bed sores. You will rot in a dark, filthy room, staring at a cracked ceiling, completely forgotten by your corporate executives and your high-priced attorneys. And while you are slowly, silently decaying in that wretched facility, Bradley and I will be living like royalty in your multi-million-dollar mansion, spending every single penny that you broke your body and your spirit to earn. You are finished, Madison. You lose." Beatrice straightened her posture, fixed me with one final contemptuous, lingering glare, and turned on her heel. She adjusted her expensive scarf with practiced elegance and marched out of the intensive care unit, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind her and leaving me entirely alone in the dim, quiet room. I lay there absorbing the full, staggering magnitude of her threats. They genuinely believed I was a defeated, paralyzed victim drifting toward a miserable and silent end. They were fully prepared to discard my living body into a medical nightmare to secure their stolen luxury. But as the door clicked shut, something truly extraordinary occurred. Deep inside my right arm, a sudden sharp jolt of pure electrical energy fired through my damaged nerves. It was not a phantom sensation or a desperate imagining. It was a real, violent, burning spark of neurological activity. Racing down my forearm, straight past my wrist, and directly into my hand. My right index finger twitched. The movement was microscopic, barely a fraction of an inch, but it was undeniable, unmistakable, and magnificent. Seconds later, a fierce, flooding sensation of pins and needles consumed my right palm entirely. My middle finger curled slightly inward, brushing against the rough texture of the hospital blanket beneath it. The terrifying grip of spinal shock was officially beginning to break. The severe trauma swelling pressing against my cervical spine had started to subside, allowing my brain to tentatively, powerfully begin reconnecting with my physical body. I was regaining my motor function. A ferocious, triumphant scream echoed silently through every corridor of my mind. I could feel the cool, air-conditioned breeze from the overhead vent touching my fingertips. I could feel the stiff fabric of the medical gown pressing against my collarbone. The returning sensory input was overwhelming and indescribably beautiful, a symphony of sensation after days of absolute, terrifying silence. But I understood with absolute, disciplined clarity that if I revealed this recovery to the medical staff right now, the entire strategic operation would be compromised irrevocably. Bradley would instantly transform into the relieved, weeping husband and desperately scramble to cover every trace of his murderous actions. He would delete the viral videos, conceal the crowdfunding money, and insist that the entire scheme had been born of nothing but grief and desperation. He would walk free. I could not allow that. Not for a single moment. I had to remain completely, convincingly paralyzed. I had to maintain this physical prison, to play the role of the helpless, brain-dead victim with flawless, disciplined perfection, until the precise, devastating moment to strike. I forced my recovering hand to relax, aggressively suppressing the overwhelming and intoxicating urge to move freely. I locked my gaze forward on the acoustic ceiling tiles, fully and completely embracing the role I had been assigned against my will. While beneath the surface, my nervous system roared quietly and gloriously back to life, preparing my body for the most important performance of my existence. The sterile silence of the intensive care unit was broken only by the steady, rhythmic pulse of my heart monitor. I lay perfectly motionless, commanding my newly awakened nerves to remain entirely dormant beneath the surface. The faint, electric tingling in my fingertips was a monumental victory. But maintaining the illusion of absolute paralysis was the only strategic priority that mattered. Then, a bright crimson notification flashed urgently across the hidden screen projected onto my right retina. The digital interface of the eye tracker buzzed with an incoming encrypted transmission from Kendrick, flagged at the highest priority level. I focused my pupil on the pulsing icon and blinked twice to open the secure channel. Kendrick did not waste a single syllable on pleasantries. His text materialized across my vision in rapid, urgent block letters. He had spent the past 12 hours methodically excavating our home network architecture. Bradley had believed himself to be a tech genius for wiping the primary security servers before the birthday party began. He had proudly and thoroughly deleted every file on the local hard drives, completely confident he had erased all digital evidence of his actions on the driveway. But Bradley was a superficial amateur who understood only the most basic surface-level concepts of network security. He had entirely overlooked the small standalone camera concealed inside the ornate bronze light fixture mounted directly above the main entrance. I had installed that specific camera 8 months ago. I had deliberately never connected it to the household wireless network. It operated on a long-lasting lithium battery and transmitted its data through its own completely independent cellular connection, uploading directly and continuously to a secure, private cloud server. I had originally acquired it because expensive watches and significant amounts of cash had been mysteriously and repeatedly disappearing from my home office. I suspected Bradley was stealing from me to secretly fund the fabricated cryptocurrency lifestyle he performed for his social media audience, and I wanted indisputable, irrefutable proof. I had never, in my darkest moments, imagined that the trap I had set for a petty household thief would end up capturing the chilling, detailed documentation of my own attempted murder. Kendrick's message continued. He had successfully breached the cloud server and retrieved every frame of uploaded footage from the evening of the party. "I am transmitting the video file now," Kendrick wrote, his words appearing stark and urgent against my retina. "You need to prepare yourself for what you are about to witness." He did not simply allow you to fall. This was entirely, deliberately premeditated. A video file materialized on the screen. I blinked to initiate playback. The high-definition footage was devastating in its clarity, capturing the full expanse of the marble staircase in front of our mansion in the warm, golden light of late afternoon. Precisely 2 hours before the first party guests arrived, Bradley stepped into the frame. He was dressed in his casual lounge clothes, carrying a small metal tin and a thick microfiber cloth. He looked around carefully, scanning the driveway and the street beyond to confirm he was completely, entirely alone. He never once thought to look up at the bronze light fixture. I watched with suffocating, mounting horror as my husband walked deliberately to the top landing of the marble staircase and dropped to his knees. He pried open the metal tin to reveal a dense industrial-grade polishing wax. He scooped a generous amount of the slick compound onto his cloth and began rubbing it aggressively into the stone surface, but with meticulous, calculated precision. He was not waxing the entire step. He was concentrating the lethal substance exclusively on one specific narrow section positioned precisely at the sharpest outer edge of the top stair. He applied layer after careful layer, buffing until the marble surface gleamed with a deadly, completely invisible slickness. He was engineering a lethal hazard designed with expert specificity to resemble an ordinary, tragic household accident. But the most terrifying portion of the footage was what he did next. Bradley stood, stepped back several paces, and studied the waxed surface with cold, clinical detachment. Then he physically mimed a backward fall, shifting his weight methodically, calculating with quiet precision the exact trajectory a human body would follow upon slipping on that specific, invisible patch. He looked down at the sharp, brutal angles of the marble edges descending below. He was measuring distances. He was carefully, deliberately ensuring that when my foot struck that invisible trap, the resulting fall would drive my head and neck into the hardest and most lethally positioned points of the staircase below. He repeated the motion twice more, adjusting his imaginary trajectory, nodding to himself with the cold, composed satisfaction of a professional working through a technical problem. He was choreographing my death. He was engineering maximum catastrophic trauma to my brainstem and cervical spine, with the methodical precision of someone who had thought about this moment at length. Once he was completely satisfied with his lethal handiwork, he packed his supplies with practiced calm, carefully wiped his fingerprints from the tin, and walked back into the house to change into his custom Italian suit for the party. The video froze on the final image, the empty, weaponized staircase bathed in the fading afternoon light, waiting patiently for me. The air in my hospital room suddenly felt impossibly thin. The monitors beeped with mechanical indifference, entirely masking the absolute hurricane of rage and adrenaline detonating through my rapidly recovering body. This was no longer a case of domestic financial exploitation. This was no longer merely a desperate husband leveraging a tragic accident to seize corporate funds. What I had just witnessed elevated his crimes to an entirely different and unforgivable dimension. This was cold-blooded, meticulously calculated attempted murder in the first degree. Bradley had plotted my physical destruction with the precise, chilling deliberation of a predator who had been planning this moment for a very long time. He had wanted me dead. He had wanted to inherit my empire as the grieving, sympathetic widower. Kendrick's final message appeared beneath the video file. I have secured multiple independent backups of this footage across separate servers. I am assembling the complete dossier for Harrison Cole right now. We have him. Completely and irrefutably. I stared at the words. Beneath the hospital blanket, my right hand twitched with increasing, barely contained force against the sheets. The electric tingling in my limbs was intensifying by the minute, growing stronger, spreading further, matching the ferocious mounting power surging through every corner of my mind. Bradley had spent the last 48 hours parading through this hospital with manufactured grief and calculated arrogance, playing the devastated victim, shedding performed tears, and demanding access to my millions. He genuinely, completely believed he was the most intelligent person in every room he entered. He was absolutely convinced he had executed the perfect crime and walked away clean. He had no idea, not even the faintest shadow of a suspicion, that he had performed his murderous, methodical rehearsal directly in front of a high-definition surveillance lens. He had no idea that the woman he believed he had broken beyond all usefulness was lying in the hospital bed he passed every day, watching his every move, assembling his permanent destruction, and quietly, steadily regaining the physical strength to deliver the final blow. The digital evidence was now secured in the hands of my brilliant brother-in-law and my most ruthless legal weapon. The trap was fully loaded. And my husband was about to face the full, devastating, inescapable weight of federal justice. The digital interface projected onto my retina flashed with sudden, urgent violence, demanding immediate attention. Kendrick was nowhere near finished dismantling the carefully constructed illusion of my marriage. Another heavily encrypted file materialized in my field of vision, its priority marker glowing in stark, demanding red. I focused my pupil and blinked twice to open the data packet, bracing myself for whatever fresh darkness my brilliant brother-in-law had excavated from the corrupted depths of my husband's hidden digital life. The previous video had established his murderous intent with irrefutable clarity. But this new dossier provided something equally devastating, the precise, suffocating financial motivation behind his lethal decision. The files cascading across my vision assembled a portrait of absolute, desperate financial ruin. Kendrick had peeled back the superficial, carefully curated layers of Bradley's fraudulent public cryptocurrency portfolio and drilled directly into the hidden, encrypted ledgers buried deep on the dark web. Bradley was not simply an unsuccessful entrepreneur making poor decisions in a volatile digital market. He was a dead man walking on a rapidly expiring timeline. The hidden financial ledgers revealed that my husband had borrowed aggressively and illegally on margin from a highly dangerous offshore criminal syndicate. He had used their illicit capital to fund a massive, entirely unregulated cryptocurrency venture. When the digital market suffered a catastrophic rapid collapse 6 months ago, his entire fraudulent fund evaporated overnight, leaving him holding nothing but an empty, worthless shell. The final catastrophic balance sheet figure, highlighted in red by Kendrick, stared back at me from across the darkness. Bradley owed this violent underground organization exactly $3 million. Attached to the financial ledger were dozens of intercepted messages originating from untraceable burner accounts. They were not civil collection notices or standard legal correspondences. They were graphic, explicit, detailed promises of brutal physical violence, describing precisely, methodically, what the syndicate intended to do to him and to his mother if $3 million was not transferred in full before the end of the current month. The deadline was approaching with merciless speed. Bradley was completely out of time, entirely out of options, and utterly devoid of legitimate leverage. That was the precise, undeniable reason he had grown so dangerously, irrationally desperate to seize absolute control over my corporate liquidity. My successful firm was his only remaining lifeline to prevent a violent and bloody end. But Kendrick was meticulous, and the final document in the encrypted packet was the most chilling piece of evidence yet. It was a high-resolution digital scan of my own premium life insurance policy, the one I had signed 5 years ago, in a moment of naive and misplaced trust, designating Bradley as the primary uncontested beneficiary, because I foolishly believed we were building a lifelong partnership founded on genuine mutual devotion. Kendrick had circled the final payout figure in red: $10 million, guaranteed, clean, and uncontested in the event of my accidental, unexpected death. His monstrous, calculated logic was suddenly and completely laid bare before my eyes. Bradley had engineered a horrifying, apparently foolproof scenario for himself. If I survived the fall, but remained permanently incapacitated beneath a forged power of attorney, he could systematically and methodically drain my corporate accounts over time to service the criminal debt. But if the fall proved fatal, if I had succumbed to my severe spinal injuries and died on that cold marble driveway, he would have received an immediate, perfectly legal, entirely untraceable $10 million insurance payout. Either outcome served his survival. Either way, my absolute physical destruction was the sole, indispensable key to his continued existence. As I absorbed the full, nauseating depravity of his financial motive, the heavy hospital door cracked open by a few bare inches. Bradley did not step fully inside the room. He stood in the narrow gap, his back angled slightly toward my bed, speaking in a hushed, frantic, barely controlled whisper into his cell phone. The sterile acoustics of the trauma ward amplified every syllable perfectly, delivering his panicked words directly to my ears with crystal clarity. I do not care what the hospital administration says or what bureaucratic protocols they are attempting to enforce, Bradley hissed aggressively into the receiver. Harrison Cole managed to freeze the primary accounts, but that old dinosaur cannot block a direct physical transfer of her private corporate shares. We are executing the backup plan right now. Prepare the secondary share transfer documents immediately and bring them directly to the hospital tonight. A brief, tense pause followed as the person on the other end clearly raised a legal objection concerning my physical incapacitation and inability to execute a binding contract. Bradley let out a low, venomous scoff that turned my blood to ice. I do not care if she cannot physically hold a pen, Bradley growled, his voice vibrating with ruthless, unhinged determination. She is completely paralyzed from the neck down and cannot offer any resistance whatsoever. The law explicitly permits a physical thumbprint in lieu of a signature for incapacitated individuals. I will take her hand myself and press her thumb firmly onto the signature line. I will make sure the impression is clean and legally valid. Just ensure the notary is compensated appropriately and get those transfer documents into this room. We execute the final transfer tonight." He ended the call and pulled the door completely shut, leaving me alone in the sterile silence of the room. A cold, predatory calm settled over my highly active mind. Beneath the thick woven fabric of the hospital blanket, my right hand twitched with controlled, deliberate force. The burning electric fire of returning nerve function was spreading rapidly, up through my arm, past my elbow, and deep into my shoulder. I flexed my fingers carefully, feeling the coarse cotton weave of the sheets pressing against my skin with glorious, vivid clarity. I could form a complete, tight, fully functioning fist. I was no longer a paralyzed victim trapped inside a broken shell. I was a fully mobile, acutely dangerous weapon waiting patiently in the dark. Bradley intended to force my thumb onto a fraudulent contract to steal my entire company and every asset attached to my name. He genuinely believed he had cornered a helpless, brain-dead woman who could offer zero resistance and mount no defense. He thought he was executing a brilliant, foolproof endgame designed to save himself from the criminal organization hunting him with increasing urgency. He had absolutely no idea that I was going to allow him to bring those fraudulent documents directly into this room. I was going to let him believe, completely and thoroughly, that he had won his desperate, ugly game. And then I was going to let the trap close around him. The heavy door to my intensive care unit hissed open, fracturing the midnight silence. Bradley marched into the dim room, followed closely by two men I had never seen before. One wore a cheap, visibly wrinkled suit and clutched a heavy leather briefcase against his chest with both hands. The other was dressed in a pristine white medical coat layered over an expensive tailored shirt, a stethoscope draped carelessly around his neck like an afterthought. They moved with the twitchy, over-caffeinated energy of men attempting to execute a high-stakes criminal operation before the window of opportunity closed permanently. Bradley turned the lock on the hospital door behind him, sealing all of us inside. He had bypassed the strict visitor protocols entirely, likely through a combination of well-placed bribes and calculated timing, waiting for the precise moment when the floor nurses were drawn away by an emergency code down the hall. He walked directly to the side of my bed, his eyes burning with manic, desperate intensity. The syndicate deadline was pressing down on him from every direction, and he was prepared to cross every remaining legal and moral line to survive it. Bradley gestured sharply toward the man in the white coat. "This is Dr. Gallagher, a private neurological consultant," he announced in a low, tightly controlled voice vibrating with malicious intent. "He is here to formally assess your cognitive state for the legal record." Dr. Gallagher stepped forward and produced a small penlight from his breast pocket. He did not glance at my detailed medical charts. He did not examine the complex array of hospital monitors tracking my vital signs with continuous precision. He simply directed the harsh beam of light into my pupils for 2 brief, perfunctory seconds. "Excellent pupillary response," Dr. Gallagher stated in a cold, rehearsed monotone. He turned to the man in the wrinkled suit. "As a licensed medical professional, I formally declare that the patient is experiencing acute physical paralysis, but remains entirely lucid and fully cognitively aware of her surroundings. She is completely capable of comprehending and consenting to binding legal agreements, even in the absence of conventional motor function to sign them." It was a flawlessly rehearsed, utterly reprehensible performance. Bradley had purchased a corrupt physician to bypass the hospital's legitimate medical oversight and legally validate the theft of everything I had spent my life constructing. The man in the suit, a bribed notary public who introduced himself only as Mr. Finch, hastily extracted a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and spread them methodically across my adjustable tray table. "These documents constitute the final transfer agreement for your wealth management firm and all associated personal assets," Bradley whispered, leaning aggressively over the metal bed rail until his face hovered directly above mine. His breath, sharp with mint and barely concealed desperation, washed over my face and made my stomach contract with revulsion. The paperwork legally transfers 100% of your corporate shares, your entire real estate portfolio, and all private investment accounts directly into my personal holding company. Your ruthless corporate attorney managed to freeze the bank accounts earlier today, but Harrison Cole cannot obstruct a direct, voluntary transfer of ownership. Once your thumbprint is on these pages, I own everything you have ever built. Every last piece of it. Give me the keys to the kingdom. Right now. I lay perfectly, serenely still on the sterile mattress. The burning sensation in my limbs had grown significantly stronger over the past several hours, spreading and intensifying with each passing minute. My muscles were practically humming with returning strength and readiness. I could have raised my arm in that moment and removed the expression from his face with one deliberate, forceful movement. But doing so would only have driven him out of the building and into the arms of whatever escape plan he and Beatrice had assembled as a contingency. I needed him to commit. I needed him to press himself irrevocably and completely into the center of the trap. I needed him to sign his own name to his federal conviction in front of the eye tracker lens that was recording every frame. Mr. Finch unscrewed the cap of a black ink pad and positioned it precisely beside the transfer documents. Bradley reached down and seized my right wrist with both hands. He clearly anticipated encountering the dead, unresponsive weight of a fully paralyzed limb. I instantly and completely forced my muscles into absolute limpness, offering zero initial resistance as he lifted my hand toward the ink pad. But to maintain the perfect, convincing illusion, I needed to give him a credible performance. I widened my eyes in carefully calibrated mock terror. I allowed my breathing to turn rapid and shallow, deliberately triggering a visible, frantic spike on the electronic heart monitor beside the bed. I locked my gaze directly onto his face and projected an expression of absolute, helpless, desperate panic. Bradley stared back at me with naked greed, drinking in every detail of my fabricated fear with visible, disturbing satisfaction. He let out a slow, dark laugh that filled the quiet room. "Stop resisting, Madison," he mocked, entirely misreading my rapid breathing as a pitiful, futile attempt to fight his control. "You have no power remaining, not a single fragment of it. Your entire empire belongs to me now." He pressed my index finger firmly into the black ink. I deliberately tensed the tendons in my wrist by the most fractional, barely perceptible degree, creating the convincing sensation of a desperately weakened woman attempting one last hopeless resistance against his grip. Bradley immediately tightened his hold on my knuckles with crushing, contemptuous force, crushing my fake struggle effortlessly. He drove my inked thumb down onto the signature line of the primary transfer document with punishing firmness. He repeated the motion, second page, third page, fourth, pressing my flesh deliberately and completely against each line until the fraudulent transaction was fully and irrevocably sealed. Mr. Finch gathered the stamped documents with practiced efficiency, applied his official notary seal to each page with methodical care, and handed the completed criminal portfolio back to my husband. Bradley pressed the paperwork against his chest like a man clutching a lifeline thrown to him from a sinking ship. He was imprinting his own magnificent, irreversible crimes onto federal documents, entirely oblivious to the fact that the paralyzed woman he was currently brutalizing and robbing was, at this precise moment, constructing the walls of the prison cell he would spend the next several decades occupying. The trap was fully set. The execution had been flawless. The suffocating atmosphere in the intensive care unit grew heavier still as Bradley held my wrist firmly against the adjustable hospital tray, savoring what he believed was his final, complete victory. I maintained my ragged, terrified breathing with disciplined precision, playing the victim to absolute convincing perfection. But the violation of my space was not yet finished. From the dim corner of the room near the sliding glass door, two additional figures materialized silently from the shadows. Beatrice and Caroline had slipped inside during the fraudulent doctor's assessment, moving without a sound while the corrupt physician and the bribed notary prepared their operation. They had come to witness the final destruction of my corporate empire with their own eager, triumphant eyes. Caroline moved to the left side of my bed and positioned herself directly over my outstretched left hand, which rested limply and apparently lifeless on top of the sterile white hospital blanket. She did not spare a single glance for my bruised and bandaged face. She possessed no empathy, no basic human recognition of my suffering, only a focused, glittering greed directed entirely at what she believed she could still extract from my helpless body. While Bradley remained consumed with securing the fraudulent asset transfer on my right side, Caroline had identified what she calculated to be a separate, personal opportunity. She leaned aggressively over the metal bed rail, her cheap floral perfume colliding unpleasantly with the sharp, clinical scent of hospital antiseptic. She reached out and seized my left hand without ceremony or hesitation. Her fingers were cold and remarkably rough as she handled my supposedly paralyzed limb with the casual, utilitarian indifference of someone retrieving a misplaced object. She did not treat me as a human being who had just survived a catastrophic physical trauma. She treated me like a lifeless department store mannequin displaying expensive jewelry in a window. I watched through the outer edge of my peripheral vision as she aggressively yanked at my left ring finger, targeting the flawless 5-carat diamond wedding band I had purchased entirely for myself after Bradley claimed his startup funds were temporarily tied up and he could not afford a proper ring. The massive stone slid off my finger with a sharp, painful scrape against my knuckle. Caroline held the brilliant diamond up to the dim hospital lighting, a look of pure, unfiltered avarice washing completely across her features. She shoved the $1 million ring deep into the pocket of her designer jacket without a flicker of hesitation. But her brazen theft did not end there. She turned her undivided, greedy attention immediately to my wrist, fixing her eyes on the custom platinum Rolex I wore every single day. The watch I had gifted myself as a personal milestone celebration the day my wealth management firm successfully secured its very first billion-dollar client portfolio. Caroline fumbled impatiently with the intricate platinum clasp, her sharp nails digging into the delicate skin of my wrist and leaving angry red half-moon marks pressed into my flesh. I suppressed with tremendous focused effort the overwhelming and furious urge to close my hand into a fist and snap her greedy wrist entirely in half. The nerves in my left arm were fully, vibrantly alive, surging with hot electrical energy and rapidly returning strength. But I commanded the muscles to remain completely flaccid, entirely unresponsive. I allowed my arm to fall uselessly against the mattress as she finally unhooked the heavy timepiece with a small, satisfied grunt. "You are bedridden anyway," Caroline whispered directly into my ear, her voice dripping with counterfeit sympathy that barely concealed the malicious delight underneath. "You will not be needing heavy jewelry in the nursing home. Let me hold on to these for you so they do not get misplaced in the hospital laundry." She smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and fastened my platinum watch onto her own wrist with practiced, proprietary ease. She admired the expensive metal gleaming against her skin, utterly and completely detached from the horrifying reality of what she had just done. She was actively robbing a paralyzed woman on her supposed deathbed, and she felt absolutely zero remorse. My internal rage burned with the intensity of a collapsing star. But I held my facial muscles perfectly slack, my eyes fixed forward and vacant. Every stolen item was simply another substantial federal felony charge I was going to add, with considerable satisfaction to her eventual indictment. Kendrick's hidden eye tracker was recording every second of her brazen theft in high-definition clarity. On the right side of the bed, Bradley ignored his sister's criminal behavior entirely. His complete and total focus was locked onto the bright red ink pad resting on the adjustable tray table. The corrupt notary had specifically insisted on red ink for the thumbprint, ensuring that the unique ridges of my fingerprint would scan cleanly into the digital banking system without bleeding into the dense black text of the surrounding legal documents. Bradley gripped my right index finger with brutal, deliberate force. He pressed the sensitive pad of my thumb deep into the bright crimson sponge, coating my flesh thoroughly in the thick, sticky dye. "This is it," Bradley breathed, a crazed and desperate anticipation radiating from his entire body like heat from an open flame. "Say goodbye to your precious company, Madison." He wrenched my hand violently away from the ink pad and drove my thumb down onto the final signature line of the massive corporate transfer contract with punishing, absolute force. He pressed down so hard I could feel the bone grinding against the hard plastic surface of the tray table beneath the parchment. He held the pressure for 3 long, deliberate seconds, ensuring the print registered with complete, legally acceptable clarity. When he finally released my hand, a stark, vivid red fingerprint remained permanently etched onto the heavy parchment paper, sitting on the page like a single drop of fresh blood. It was done. The fraudulent document had been fully and irreversibly executed. Mr. Finch snatched the paper immediately, applied his official notary seal with a loud, definitive crunch, and slid the entire criminal portfolio back into his worn leather briefcase. Dr. Gallagher simply nodded once, packed up his useless penlight, and slipped out the hospital door without uttering a single additional word. They had delivered what they believed was the final blow and collected their illicit payments. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind the 2 corrupt professionals, the quiet hospital room erupted into a grotesque, sickening celebration. Bradley snatched the finalized transfer confirmation copy from the tray table. He threw his head back and released a loud, maniacal laugh that bounced sharply off the acoustic ceiling tiles, a purely unhinged sound, the manic, shaking relief of a desperate criminal who genuinely believed he had just narrowly escaped a brutal execution by the underground syndicate that had been hunting him down. "We did it!" Bradley shouted, waving the paper in the air like a man clutching a winning lottery ticket. "I own absolutely everything." "Absolutely you do!" Beatrice rushed forward from the shadows, her face radiant with malicious, triumphant pride. She threw her arms tightly around her son and embraced him with fierce, possessive adoration. "You are brilliant, Bradley," she declared loudly, her voice saturated with toxic maternal reverence. "I always knew you would take exactly what this family deserves." Caroline came rushing around the foot of my hospital bed and eagerly joined their embrace, the stolen platinum of my Rolex catching and reflecting the harsh fluorescent light as she threw her arms around her brother and mother with gleeful abandon. The 3 of them jumped together, laughed hysterically, and celebrated their supposed absolute victory right in the center of my intensive care unit, right in front of my face. They danced around my hospital bed with manic, unself-conscious joy, completely ignoring the woman they were entirely convinced they had permanently and irrevocably destroyed. I lay absolutely motionless. The bright red ink dried slowly on the pad of my thumb. I watched my husband, my mother-in-law, and my sister-in-law revel openly in their unforgivable crimes. They believed the red fingerprint represented my total, unconditional surrender. They had absolutely no conception that it was, in truth, the ultimate and inescapable seal on their impending federal prison sentences. Let them laugh. Let them celebrate. Let them wear my stolen diamonds and toast their hollow victory. Tomorrow morning, when the federal authorities came for them, the look of absolute soul-crushing terror on their faces was going to be worth every single agonizing second of this charade. The premature celebration in the sterile intensive care unit wound down as Bradley shifted his focus entirely and urgently toward the digital component of his heist. He practically shoved his mother and sister out of his immediate orbit, grabbed his sleek silver laptop from his leather briefcase, and slapped it down onto the rolling tray table beside the red ink pad he had just used to brand my thumb. His fingers flew across the keyboard with frantic, desperate velocity. The syndicate deadline was a loaded weapon pressed directly against his skull, and he needed $10 million routed to his offshore accounts before the morning sun breached the city skyline. I kept my breathing perfectly shallow and my gaze locked in its vacant forward stare. From my peripheral vision, I watched him open a secure, encrypted video conferencing application, bypassing standard customer service channels entirely and connecting directly to the elite 24-hour emergency liaison desk at my primary investment bank. This was a dedicated line reserved exclusively for high-net-worth clients navigating catastrophic financial emergencies. The video call connected with a crisp digital chime. A sharply dressed bank executive materialized on screen, seated in a brightly lit office despite the late hour. His nameplate identified him as Director Montgomery. He adjusted his glasses and regarded Bradley with a careful mixture of professional courtesy and mild uncertainty. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes. We received your emergency notification. How can the Private Wealth Division assist you tonight?" Bradley immediately adopted his performance with sickening, well-practiced ease. He slumped his shoulders and forced his voice into a ragged, trembling register of fabricated sorrow. "Director Montgomery, I am calling directly from the intensive care unit. My wife Madison suffered a catastrophic spinal injury this evening. The leading neurologists have just officially declared her permanently incapacitated. It is an absolute nightmare." Director Montgomery's expression fell immediately into one of genuine corporate sympathy. "I am so deeply sorry to hear that, sir. Madison is one of our most valued clients. Please tell me what we can do to support you during this terrible time." Bradley wasted not a single second. He snatched the freshly stamped contract from the foot of the bed and held it squarely in front of the laptop camera. The bright red fingerprint was prominently, unmistakably displayed on the screen. "I have a legally binding, fully notarized power of attorney and a complete corporate transfer agreement," Bradley stated, his tone pivoting abruptly from grief-stricken husband to aggressive corporate dictator. "I am assuming total executive control of her wealth management firm and all personal liquid assets, effective immediately. I am transmitting the high-resolution digital scans to your secure portal right now." He struck a key on the keyboard, initiating the transmission of the fraudulent files through the banking interface. "I need you to authorize an immediate emergency wire transfer of $10 million to my designated holding account. The firm is facing enormous market exposure in the wake of news about her accident. I must secure this capital immediately to stabilize the portfolios and cover her impending experimental medical treatments." I lay paralyzed on the mattress, my heart slamming against my ribs. He was so staggeringly, magnificently arrogant. He genuinely believed that a stamped piece of paper and a fabricated tragedy would compel a major financial institution to surrender $10 million in the middle of the night. Director Montgomery hesitated, his eyes scanning the documents that had populated on his end of the system. "Sir, this is an exceptionally large sum to move outside of standard operating hours. Protocol requires a 24-hour verification period for a transfer of this magnitude, especially when it involves a sudden and significant change in executive authority." "I do not have 24 hours!" Bradley roared, slamming his fist onto the tray table with enough force to make the laptop shudder visibly on the screen. "You are looking at a legally executed document, verified by a licensed medical professional and a state notary. If you do not process this transfer right this second, I will hold you personally liable for the complete financial collapse of her firm. I will sue this bank into absolute oblivion. Do your job and release my money now." Beatrice leaned forward into the frame, crowding her son's shoulder and glaring directly into the camera with undisguised fury. "We are dealing with a massive family tragedy, and you are playing bureaucratic games with my daughter-in-law's medical fund," she hissed. "Transfer the money immediately, or I will personally ensure the press knows precisely how this institution treats grieving families." Faced with the compounding threats of a massive lawsuit and a devastating public relations catastrophe, Director Montgomery finally capitulated. "I understand the urgency entirely, sir. Please give me one moment. I am overriding the standard holding protocol and initiating the executive transfer now." Bradley exhaled a long, ragged breath of triumphant relief. He angled his laptop screen slightly to give himself a better view of the banking portal as it loaded. Through the tiny lens of the eye tracker concealed on my oxygen tube, I had a perfect high-definition view of his computer screen. The bank's secure dashboard populated a large green progress bar. The $10 million wire transfer was officially pending. The bar began to fill, slowly, inexorably, climbing from 10% to 40%. Bradley leaned progressively closer to the screen, his eyes wide and completely mesmerized by the digital representation of his stolen fortune materializing before him. 50%. 70%. He was practically vibrating in his chair with malicious, barely contained joy. He turned to look directly at me with a disgusting, victorious sneer twisting his features, convinced he had beaten me, beaten my lawyers, and secured his escape from the criminal organization that had been circling him. 85%. 95%. Then the entire digital world stopped. The smooth green progress bar froze on the screen without warning. The quiet hum of the laptop fan seemed to amplify dramatically in the sudden, terrifying silence. Bradley frowned, clicking his mouse frantically. "Process, you stupid machine," he muttered through his teeth, tapping the glass trackpad with rapidly escalating aggression. Suddenly, the sleek, professional banking interface vanished entirely. The screen flashed violently, turning a blinding, aggressive, unmistakable shade of solid crimson red. A massive warning box exploded across the center of the display, bold white letters screaming a single, inescapable, catastrophic message: "Fraud alert. Federal investigation active. All assets seized by United States government authority." The harsh, loud error chime blasted from the laptop speakers, reverberating through the intensive care unit like a digital death sentence. Bradley physically recoiled from the computer as though it had burned him. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him a pale, terrified ghost. He stared at the glowing red screen, his mouth opening and closing in absolute speechless disbelief. "What is this?" Bradley screamed into the still-active video call, his voice fracturing into a high-pitched shriek of raw panic. "What did you just do to my account? Release the hold right now." On the other end of the call, Director Montgomery looked genuinely bewildered, his hands raised instinctively in front of him. "I did not do this, sir," the banker stammered, his eyes darting frantically across his own monitors. "The system locked me out completely. This is not a standard bank freeze. This is a direct federal injunction. The system is indicating the Federal Bureau of Investigation has flagged these specific accounts for major wire fraud and money laundering activity. I have completely lost all access and override capability." "You are lying!" Bradley roared, grabbing the laptop with both hands and shaking it violently. "I gave you a legal power of attorney. That money belongs to me. Fix it. Fix it right this second before I destroy you." Director Montgomery straightened in his chair, his professional demeanor replaced entirely by an instinct of legal self-preservation. "Sir, I am required by federal law to terminate this call and report this interaction to the relevant authorities immediately. Do not contact this bank again." The video call cut to black, leaving Bradley staring alone at the mocking, glowing red error screen. The $10 million he desperately, urgently needed to save his life from the criminal syndicate had been swallowed whole by a federal void. The deadline was still ticking with merciless precision, and he was standing in a hospital room, holding absolutely nothing but a worthless forged piece of paper and the ruins of his carefully constructed plan. He had not merely failed to steal my money, he had triggered an active, massive federal investigation, and his digital fingerprints were smothered comprehensively across every inch of the crime scene. Bradley completely lost his mind. He grabbed the heavy hospital tray table with both hands and hurled it violently across the room. The metal frame crashed against the wall with a deafening impact, sending the ink pad and the scattered fraudulent contracts flying across the sterile linoleum floor. He screamed a torrent of vicious, unintelligible curses that echoed off every surface. Finally, viscerally, and catastrophically, understanding that his brilliant, murderous heist had transformed into a spectacular, inescapable, federally documented suicide mission. The deafening crash of the metal tray table left a ringing electric silence in the intensive care unit. The scattered papers and overturned red ink pads stained the pristine linoleum like a fresh, chaotic crime scene. Bradley stood hyperventilating in the center of the wreckage, his perfectly tailored suit rumpled and sweat-dampened, his face a mask of absolute terror and unhinged desperation. The glowing red federal warning on his laptop screen cast a cold, sinister hue across his blanched features. Beatrice and Caroline stood frozen in the shadows of the corner, their grotesque premature celebration extinguished in an instant. The shattering, sudden transition from arrogant triumph to catastrophic failure had rendered them both completely and utterly speechless. Caroline instinctively yanked her sleeve down to conceal the stolen platinum watch on her wrist. Beatrice clutched her expensive wrap tightly around her shoulders, as though it might somehow shield her from what was coming. They could feel the immense, suffocating danger closing in around them from every direction, but they had no conception yet of how vast and total the storm was about to be. I maintained my perfectly rigid posture on the hospital mattress. My eyes remained fixed on the ceiling tiles, projecting the carefully sustained illusion of a brain-dead victim. But beneath the thick cotton blankets, the adrenaline surging through my fully recovered nervous system was electric and exhilarating. My right hand was clenched into a tight, ready fist. I was more than prepared for the final act. The sliding glass doors of my private medical suite did not simply open. They were forced apart with a violent, authoritative slam that made the entire doorframe shudder with the impact. The force of the entry seemed to physically suck the remaining sterile air from the room. Bradley spun around, his body jerking in pure, startled shock. Beatrice let out a sharp, involuntary gasp and pressed herself backward against the wall. Harrison Cole strode into the intensive care unit with the unstoppable, controlled momentum of a freight train that has never once considered braking. The silver-haired corporate attorney wore none of his usual polished professional civility. His face was set in a ruthless, predatory expression that promised absolute, measured, and total destruction. He was not alone. Marching directly behind him was the chief of the local police department, fully uniformed, his hand resting casually and deliberately on his utility belt. Flanking the police chief were two individuals in crisp, dark suits, with bright yellow FBI insignia emblazoned across the backs of their windbreakers. The Federal Bureau of Investigation special agents moved through the doorway with terrifying, synchronized precision. Their trained eyes scanning the chaotic room in seconds and immediately identifying every relevant threat and every potential exit. The sheer, overwhelming display of combined legal and federal authority consumed the small medical suite entirely. The air grew instantly thick and suffocating with the weight of it. Bradley took a frantic, stumbling step backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the scattered fraudulent documents he had hurled across the floor moments earlier. His eyes moved rapidly, from the local police officers to the federal agents, to Harrison Cole. The full reality of his situation was cascading down around him in crushing waves. But his deep, pathological narcissism refused to allow him to surrender quietly, even now. Bradley dropped frantically to his knees and scrambled across the floor, grabbing desperately at the scattered pages of the corporate transfer agreement. He snatched the final page, the one bearing the stark, bright red impression of my thumb, and lurched back to his feet. He thrust the document forward in front of him like a fragile, inadequate shield, pointing a trembling finger at Harrison. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Bradley screamed, his voice fracturing between raw panic and desperately manufactured outrage. "You have absolutely no legal right to force your way into my wife's private medical suite. I am the legal head of her estate. I am the acting chief executive officer of her firm. You are trespassing, Harrison. Every single one of you. Get out of this hospital right now before I have you all sued for criminal harassment." Harrison did not blink. He did not flinch. He stopped at the foot of my hospital bed, folded his arms across his tailored jacket, and watched my husband unravel before him with the cold, deeply satisfied expression of a man who has spent 40 years waiting for precisely this moment. "Look at this," Bradley roared with increasing frantic violence, shaking the paper in the air so the federal agents could clearly see the crimson ink. "This is a fully notarized, legally binding transfer of ownership. My wife just granted me total executive control. She signed over 100% of her corporate shares and every personal asset she possesses. I brought a licensed medical consultant and a state notary into this room to formally verify her cognitive capacity. She is completely physically paralyzed, but she understood exactly what she was doing. She pressed her own thumb onto that signature line to protect her company from imminent market volatility. I am the sole and legitimate owner of everything. You cannot touch me. You cannot freeze my accounts. The law is on my side." He was panting heavily now, his eyes darting in rapid, desperate arcs between the completely unmoved faces of the law enforcement professionals surrounding him. He expected the badge-carrying authorities to honor and respect the legal weight of a fully notarized contract. He was clinging with everything he had left to the delusion that his red ink pad and his bribed officials had outmaneuvered the federal government of the United States. The two FBI special agents exchanged a brief, trained glance and moved. With terrifying, fluid synchronicity, they stepped forward and positioned themselves directly in front of the heavy glass doors, entirely sealing the only exit from the intensive care unit. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their postures rigid and completely unyielding, an impenetrable human wall with no observable weakness. The local police chief moved with equal purpose toward the dark corner where Beatrice and Caroline were cowering, placing himself firmly between the two women and any conceivable path to the hallway. He rested his hand near his radio, his gaze locked steadily on the mother and daughter who had conspired to loot my body while I lay bleeding. They were entirely, completely surrounded. The steel trap had finally slammed shut, and all three of them were caught decisively inside it. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Bradley held the fraudulent contract in front of him, his hand shaking so violently that the paper fluttered visibly under the harsh fluorescent lights. He was breathing in rapid, shallow spasms, desperately willing Harrison Cole to look at that red thumbprint and acknowledge defeat. Harrison did not look defeated. He did not look intimidated. He did not look even remotely concerned. Instead, a slow, freezing smile spread gradually across the veteran attorney's face. The particular, unhurried smile of a seasoned apex predator who has just watched his prey walk voluntarily into a steel cage and lock the door from the inside. Harrison reached calmly into his tailored jacket, produced a sleek pair of reading glasses, and slipped them on with deliberate, theatrical patience. He stepped to the edge of my hospital bed, looked down at the crumpled, blood-red document trembling in my husband's grip, and then released a short, sharp, quiet laugh that cut through the tension in the room like a razor blade through wet paper. "You can go ahead and tear that pathetic piece of paper into confetti, Bradley," Harrison stated, his voice resonating through the room with supreme and lethal authority. "You can burn it. You can eat it. You can frame it and hang it on the wall of your prison cell, because that document is absolutely, unequivocally, and completely worthless." Bradley froze. His eyes widened in genuine, confused disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, thrusting the paper forward again with shaking hands. "This is a notarized transfer of personal assets. She signed over everything. I have the medical declaration. It is fully legal in this state." Harrison reached slowly into his heavy leather briefcase. He did not produce a single sheet of paper. Instead, he withdrew a massive leather-bound binder that must have weighed at least 5 pounds, and tossed it with casual, dismissive force onto the foot of my hospital bed. The heavy binder landed directly on top of my legs with a loud, definitive, resonant thud. "3 months ago," Harrison began, pacing slowly along the foot of my bed like a tenured professor addressing a profoundly, irreparably failing student, "Madison and I sat down and comprehensively restructured her entire financial and corporate portfolio. She gave me explicit, detailed instructions to build an impenetrable legal fortress around every asset she had spent her life creating. So, we established a highly aggressive, carefully structured entity known as a revocable living trust." Beatrice let out a sharp, strangled gasp from her corner of the room, her hands flying involuntarily to her mouth. She was a suburban socialite who passed her days at country clubs and charity lunches, but even she understood the immediate and terrifying legal implications of those 3 words. Bradley, however, was a superficial amateur who had been playing a high-stakes professional game he had never once genuinely comprehended. "I am the sole, legally appointed trustee of that entity," Harrison continued, his voice gaining in volume and controlled power with every word. "Do you understand what that means, Bradley? It means that the wealth management firm does not belong to Madison as an individual anymore. The sprawling Connecticut mansion you have been living in does not belong to Madison as an individual. The investment portfolios, the liquid cash reserves, the commercial real estate holdings, none of it is registered under her personal name. Every single asset she spent her life building was legally and permanently transferred into the exclusive ownership of the trust exactly 90 days ago." Bradley's face drained of all remaining color, leaving his skin an ashen, clammy gray. His mouth opened. No sound came out. The red-inked contract in his hand began to tremble with increasing, uncontrollable violence. "A standard power of attorney grants you authority only over assets held in a person's individual name," Harrison explained, twisting the legal knife with cold, clinical, exquisite precision. "And since Madison's individual net worth currently consists of a few personal checking accounts and the ruined dress she was wearing when you pushed her down those stairs, your grand midnight heist has netted you precisely 0 corporate authority. You cannot transfer assets she does not personally own. You cannot liquidate a company she does not personally possess." "You are lying!" Bradley shrieked, his voice cracking into a high, keening wail of pure denial. "You are fabricating this to protect her. She is my wife. I have marital rights to that company. I have legal standing. You cannot do this to me." Harrison stepped directly into Bradley's personal space, towering over him with quiet, terrifying physical menace. "Marital rights do not pierce a properly structured corporate trust, you arrogant, presumptuous fool," Harrison growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, barely controlled register. "Especially not when the spouse has been explicitly and legally excluded from the beneficiary matrix, which you have been, completely and irrevocably. You brought a corrupt, paid physician and a bribed notary into a federal medical facility. You physically assaulted a paralyzed woman to force her thumbprint onto a fraudulent personal transfer agreement. And you did all of it, every calculated criminal step, to steal absolute control over an empty vault. The sheer monumental weight of his total and catastrophic failure crashed down onto Bradley's shoulders all at once. His knees buckled perceptibly beneath him. The red stamped paper slipped from his sweating, nerveless fingers and fluttered aimlessly down to the dirty hospital floor, landing with a soft, almost tender finality near his trembling shoes. He had risked everything. He had orchestrated a brutal attempted murder. He had committed multiple compounding counts of federal fraud. He had exposed himself to the violent wrath of a dangerous criminal syndicate. And he had done every single piece of it for a completely, laughably worthless and legally void piece of paper. Beatrice let out a long, agonized wail from her corner of the room as the full reality collapsed down upon her simultaneously. The mansion she had planned to inhabit, the shopping accounts she had intended to drain indefinitely, the life of stolen luxury she had been mentally furnishing for weeks. All of it was permanently and irrevocably gone. She was going to end up precisely where she had always belonged, destitute, disgraced, and facing serious federal conspiracy charges alongside her pathetic, broken son. Caroline pressed herself further into the wall, her eyes darting in frantic, involuntary arcs toward the stolen platinum watch secured around her own trembling wrist. She suddenly, acutely understood that the piece of jewelry she had stripped from my arm was no longer a prize. It was the most incriminating piece of physical evidence in the room, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation agents were blocking the only door out. I lay perfectly still beneath the hospital blankets, feeling the heavy, grounding weight of the massive trust binder resting across my legs. The overwhelming, ecstatic surge of absolute victory roared through every corner of my fully recovered mind. Bradley had spent every year of our marriage systematically underestimating my intelligence. He had concluded, without ever questioning the assumption, that I was a naive and emotionally vulnerable woman, desperate for his affection, blind to his parasitism, and incapable of defending herself against a man of his supposed genius. He never once allowed himself to consider that he was attempting to outmaneuver a financial predator who had been quietly staying 10 steps ahead of him for years. He was completely, comprehensively broken. His spirit shattered. His fabricated empire obliterated, his entire fraudulent future erased permanently by his own profound and fatal ignorance of corporate law. The stage was set with absolute perfection. The audience of federal agents and legal titans was completely captivated by his implosion. It was time for the main event. It was time for the supposedly paralyzed, brain-dead victim he had so deeply and gleefully despised to stand up and personally deliver the final blow. The devastating revelation of the living trust hung in the stagnant hospital air like a blanket of solid, suffocating lead. Bradley remained on his knees, staring vacantly at the crumpled, useless transfer document resting near his expensive leather shoes. The entire foundation of his murderous plot had been vaporized by a single leather-bound binder. Beatrice pressed her back flat against the cold wall, her hands shaking with visible, uncontrollable tremors as she finally comprehended the concrete reality of federal prison. Caroline stood completely still, her greedy fingers moving unconsciously and repeatedly over the stolen platinum watch on her wrist, the full weight of its evidentiary implications pressing down on her with each passing second. The local police chief and the 2 FBI special agents maintained their impenetrable positions at the door, their expressions carved from absolute, unwavering stone. They were not present to negotiate. They were present to execute. Harrison Cole adjusted the lapel of his jacket, his sharp, assessing gaze shifting from the defeated man on the floor to my apparently lifeless form on the bed. The stage was precisely, perfectly set. The predators had been fully disarmed and stripped of every piece of legal armor they had assembled. It was time for the ultimate resurrection. For days, I had existed as a ghost imprisoned inside my own body. I had endured the excruciating indignity of being physically handled, openly mocked, robbed, and violated by the very people who were supposed to constitute my family. I had listened to them gleefully orchestrate my financial ruin, steal my jewelry from my helpless hands, and plan my permanent exile to a neglected facility where they hoped I would quietly decay and disappear. I had felt the brutal, grinding pressure of my own husband crushing my thumb into an ink pad to forge the theft of my life's work. Now the overwhelming electric surge of adrenaline pumping through my fully recovered nervous system demanded its release. I gathered every fragment of fierce, accumulated rage and directed it with absolute precision into my right hand, the very same hand Bradley had seized and violated just minutes before. Slowly, with complete deliberation, I flexed my fingers. I formed a tight, powerful, fully capable fist, the joints cracking loudly in the dead silence of the room. The sound echoed through the suite like a gunshot. Bradley's head snapped upward, his bloodshot, tear-streaked eyes locked onto my hand. His jaw dropped open in a silent, horrified scream. He watched in pure, stupefied disbelief as I lifted my right arm smoothly and cleanly off the sterile mattress, defying completely and utterly the catastrophic, permanent medical diagnosis he had staked his entire miserable life upon. A collective, breathless gasp erupted from the dark corner where Beatrice and Caroline were cowering. They stared at me with the wide, glassy eyes of people witnessing something their minds refused to process. Beatrice's legs gave out entirely beneath her. She slid slowly down the wall until she crumpled onto the floor, her hands gripping her own hair in sheer animal panic. I brought my hand up to my face with calm, terrifying, deliberate precision. I reached up and grabbed the clear plastic tubing of the supplemental oxygen cannula wrapped around my ears, and pulled it firmly away from my nose. I tossed it onto the metal tray table without looking. Next, I reached for the rigid, suffocating cervical collar locked tightly around my throat. I dug my fingers deliberately beneath the thick straps. The loud, violent tearing sound of heavy-duty Velcro ripping apart sliced through the quiet of the hospital suite like a thunderclap. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. I pulled the heavy plastic brace from my neck and dropped it casually over the side of the bed. It clattered loudly against the linoleum floor, landing with perfect poetic precision directly beside Bradley's trembling knees. Then, planting both hands firmly against the mattress, I engaged my core and pushed myself upward. My spine, fully healed from the temporary traumatic swelling that had temporarily imprisoned me, supported my weight with flawless, effortless strength. I swung my legs over the edge of the hospital bed and sat upright, perfectly, completely straight. I rolled my shoulders back deliberately, stretching the long, stiffened muscles across my back, and looked directly down at the pathetic, broken, crumbling man kneeling on the floor beneath me. Bradley looked up. The expression on his face was unlike anything I had ever witnessed on a human being. He was not looking at a vulnerable, paralyzed wife anymore. He was staring straight into the eyes of a ruthless corporate executioner who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. His lips moved frantically, searching desperately for words his vocal cords could no longer produce. The arrogant man who had meticulously choreographed my death was now a trembling, incoherent, broken thing on a hospital floor. I allowed him to exist in that agonizing, wordless silence for a long, deliberate moment. Then I spoke. My voice was slightly rough from days without use, but it rang through the room with cold, undeniable, absolute authority. The attending physician officially confirmed that my spinal shock resolved completely 3 days ago, I stated, looking down at him with supreme, unhurried contempt. I regained full motor function within 48 hours of your pathetic attempt to murder me on our driveway. I was never in a permanent vegetative state. The shock on his face deepened into complete soul-crushing despair. You were awake, he choked out, his voice barely a raspy, broken whisper. You heard everything. I heard every single word, I confirmed, my tone carrying the quiet, devastating satisfaction of someone who has been waiting a very long time to deliver a truth. I heard you complain to your mother about hitting me too hard. I heard you plan to lock me in a state facility. I heard you brag about disabling the security cameras. I heard you outline your plan to drain my corporate accounts at dawn. I lay perfectly, voluntarily still in this bed to observe exactly how far you and your greedy family were genuinely willing to go. I needed you comfortable. I needed you confident. I needed you to bring those fraudulent documents directly into this room because I needed to gather irrefutable, high-definition evidence sufficient to constitute the federal crimes of forced contract signing, extortion, wire fraud, and attempted murder in the first degree. Bradley's entire reality imploded in a single devastating moment. The full and catastrophic understanding that he had been expertly, methodically played, manipulated, outmaneuvered, and trapped by the very woman he had tried to kill destroyed him completely. Every cruel, careless confession he had made in this room, every forged signature, every threatening phone call made in the hospital corridor, every cruel laugh, every piece of it had been meticulously monitored, recorded, and preserved. He let out a gut-wrenching, hollow groan, a sound entirely devoid of humanity, and his arms gave out beneath him entirely. He collapsed face first onto the dirty linoleum floor, burying his face against the cold tile, as the full, crushing, permanent weight of his own destruction finally broke what remained of him. The obliterating silence in the intensive care unit was interrupted by the sound of slow, deliberate, authoritative footsteps approaching from the hallway. The two FBI special agents separated just enough to admit one additional person into the crowded suite. Kendrick strode into the room, dressed in a sharp, dark suit, carrying a sleek black garment bag over one arm and a small, encrypted digital remote control in his right hand. He did not spare a single glance for the sobbing man dissolving on the floor or the two terrified women cowering in the corner. He walked with complete, focused purpose directly to the large flat-screen television mounted on the hospital wall and plugged a small encrypted flash drive into the side port. I believe the federal authorities need to see the feature presentation, Kendrick announced, his deep voice carrying absolute command over the room. He pressed a single button on the remote. The screen flickered immediately to life. The high-definition footage from my hidden, independent cellular camera began to play with brilliant, devastating clarity. The entire room watched in complete, horrified silence as the footage showed Bradley walking alone onto the marble driveway in the warm, golden light of a late afternoon, 2 hours before his birthday party guests arrived. The federal agents stepped closer to the screen, their trained eyes narrowing as they watched my husband produce a small metal tin of industrial-grade polishing wax, drop to his knees, and begin methodically applying the lethal, invisible compound to the sharpest outer edge of the top marble step. They watched him stand, step back, and pantomime my exact backward fall, physically and deliberately calculating the precise trajectory a human body would take in order to ensure maximum catastrophic damage to the cervical spine. They watched him repeat the motion, adjust the angle, nod to himself with quiet, clinical satisfaction. They watched him choreograph my death with the methodical precision of a man who had thought about this moment for a very long time. The smoking gun was smoking directly on the screen before them, undeniable, irrefutable, and complete. That is sufficient, the lead federal agent stated, his voice ringing with the flat, absolute finality of institutional authority. He turned to the police chief. "Take him." Two police officers moved in immediately. They hauled Bradley up from the floor, physically, forcibly, twisting his arms behind his back with professional efficiency. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room with a sound I will carry in my memory for the rest of my life. "Bradley Hayes, you are under arrest for attempted murder in the first degree," the police chief declared, reading the charges with cold, precise, unhurried authority. The lead federal agent stepped directly into Bradley's tear-streaked, terror-blank face. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation is formally charging you with multiple counts of federal wire fraud for soliciting $1 million across state lines through a fraudulent medical crowdfunding campaign, forced contract execution, financial extortion, and conspiracy. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in a maximum security federal penitentiary." Bradley thrashed against the officers, screaming incoherently, begging for mercy and reason. But his desperate, pathetic cries fell on ears that had heard everything they needed to hear. The officers dragged him toward the doorway without ceremony. Beatrice let out a piercing, hysterical shriek and lunged instinctively after her son. But the second federal agent moved with immediate, decisive force, seizing her by the shoulder and pressing her firmly back against the wall. "Beatrice Hayes, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to multiple counts of federal wire fraud," the agent stated, producing a second pair of steel handcuffs. Beatrice wailed in genuine, spiraling agony, crying desperately about her social standing, insisting that a woman of her suburban prestige and carefully maintained reputation could not possibly be subjected to the indignity of a county jail. The officers ignored every word of it. The cuffs locked. She was marched out. In the far corner, Caroline was visibly, physically vibrating. She watched her mother and brother being hauled away in handcuffs and looked down at her own shaking hands, becoming suddenly, acutely, and overwhelmingly aware of the stolen jewelry burning against her skin. She grabbed the platinum watch and the diamond ring with frantic, trembling fingers and ripped them off with desperate urgency. She stumbled forward, her face completely drenched, holding the stolen items out toward me with both hands. "I am so sorry," Caroline sobbed hysterically, her voice collapsing into a high, pathetic whine. "I was only holding them for safekeeping. I swear I was just keeping them safe. Please do not let them arrest me. I am your family. I am still your family." Kendrick stepped directly into her path. His tall, imposing frame blocked her completely from approaching my bed. He looked down at his wife with a slow, measured, entirely unsparing gaze. "You are a greedy, shameless thief," Kendrick stated, his voice carrying the quiet, absolute finality of a door being closed forever. "And you are no longer my family." A female police officer stepped in from behind Caroline, gripped both of her arms firmly, and fastened a third pair of handcuffs around her wrists with practiced efficiency. "Caroline Hayes, you are under arrest for grand larceny and possession of stolen property," the officer announced, guiding the weeping, completely broken woman out of the room to join her mother and brother in the waiting patrol cars below. The intensive care unit fell suddenly, wonderfully, profoundly quiet. The toxic, parasitic infection that had occupied my life, my home, my marriage, my bed, my professional world, my body, had just been surgically and permanently excised. I drew a long, slow, deep breath, filling my lungs entirely with the clean, indescribable, irreplaceable taste of absolute victory. I swung my legs fully off the hospital bed and planted my bare feet on the cool linoleum floor. I rose to my full height, my spine perfectly straight, my recovering muscles humming with strong, renewed, purposeful energy. Kendrick walked over and handed me the black garment bag he had thoughtfully brought from my home. I stepped into the private hospital bathroom, stripped off the degrading medical gown, and pulled on the crisp, perfectly tailored charcoal power suit Kendrick had retrieved from my executive closet. I buttoned the jacket. I adjusted the collar. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long, quiet, complete moment. I was not a victim. I had never truly been a victim. I was an apex predator who had been temporarily caged, and I had just dismantled every lock from the inside. I walked back into the main room projecting the fierce, unhurried, unstoppable energy of a woman who has conquered death itself and found the experience clarifying. Harrison and Kendrick stood waiting, their expressions carrying something I recognized immediately as genuine, deep, hard-earned respect. Kendrick handed me a sleek digital tablet. The screen displayed the highly encrypted network routing the massive debts Bradley owed to the violent criminal syndicate. He had desperately, pathetically hoped the fraudulent crowdfunding money would save him from their patience-eroded wrath. I tapped the screen, authorizing a permanent, irreversible digital lockdown on every hidden cryptocurrency account he possessed. I severed his access to every conceivable remaining financial resource, leaving him entirely, definitively defenseless. Let the syndicate deal with him while he rots in a federal holding cell, I said, handing the tablet back to Kendrick. He dug his own grave. Now he gets to lie in it. I turned to face the large glass windows of the hospital suite. Below, the red and blue lights of the police cruisers strobed against the dark city skyline as the patrol cars carried my traitorous husband and his greedy family away, permanently, irrevocably, forever. The storm had passed. The air was clean. My empire stood exactly where I had left it, intact, secure, and waiting. I turned back to face the two men who had stood beside me when it mattered most. My ruthless attorney and the brilliant cybersecurity expert who had placed a weapon in my hands when I had nothing else left. Cancel the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign and refund every single donor in full, I said, my voice carrying the quiet, absolute authority of someone who has returned from the dead and intends to make the most of the occasion. Then contact the major financial networks and prepare a global press conference for tomorrow morning. The chief executive officer has officially returned to work. The harrowing journey we have just witnessed carries a profound and enduring lesson about trust, resilience, and the true nature of chosen family. When you build a life from nothing, pouring your blood and your discipline and your relentless, unrewarded early years into constructing something that belongs entirely to you, you must protect what you have earned with equal ferocity and foresight. We are often raised to extend automatic, unconditional trust to the people we marry and the families we inherit through that marriage. But this story is a chilling, unforgettable reminder that legal and familial ties do not guarantee loyalty, and that proximity to your success can corrupt those who never understood the cost of building it. True security does not arise from the accumulation of wealth alone. It comes from the foresight to surround yourself with structures, systems, and allies that protect you from those who would exploit your vulnerability the moment it presents itself. Madison survived not because of luck, or a miracle, or a miraculous medical recovery. She survived because she was always 10 precise, deliberate steps ahead of the people who underestimated her. She secured her empire with an ironclad living trust. She installed her own independent surveillance. She recruited allies of integrity, people like Harrison Cole and Kendrick, who valued her for her character and her mind, not the balance of her accounts. They proved, in the most extreme and unambiguous circumstances imaginable, that real family is built on unwavering loyalty during your darkest and most terrifying hours, not on blood, not on legal paperwork, and certainly not on proximity to your bank account. And perhaps most importantly, this story proves that your origins do not define your ultimate ceiling. The exact same resilience that dragged Madison out of crushing childhood poverty, that made her work 80-hour weeks and eat pride and disappointment for breakfast and keep building anyway, gave her the psychological fortitude to lie motionless in a hospital bed, hear her husband plan her disposal, and wait with patient, ferocious discipline for the perfect moment to dismantle him. She did not allow her trauma to break her. She used it as fuel and as a weapon to completely, permanently destroy the people who tried to bury her. The ultimate revenge is not simply watching your enemies face federal justice. It is rising from the ashes they lit, standing fully upright in the ruins of the trap they built for you, and reclaiming your power completely, publicly, and unbroken. You must never allow anyone to dim the light you earned. You must never allow anyone to steal the empire you built with your own hands. And you must never underestimate the woman who clawed her way up from nothing, because she has been fighting longer than you have been planning, and she does not intend to stop.